Hello and welcome to Broadcasting Scotland. My name is Lewis McGlynn.
Hello and welcome to Broadcasting Scotland. My name is Saoirse Healy.
Hello and welcome to Broadcasting Scotland. My name is Donald C. Stewart. Broadcasting Scotland is Scotland's independent broadcaster, providing factual news, reporting on the issues important to the people of Scotland.
We are committed to public service broadcasting, and with your support, we will produce even more programmes.
Provide opportunities for young people interested in media production and broadcasting, and challenge preconceptions of what Scottish media looks like, amplifying Scotland's voice and reflecting its communities.
We can already deliver high-quality live news, and we will create the highest quality programmes for you to enjoy, but we can only do that with your support.
So please subscribe to and share our channel or donate to Broadcasting Scotland via the link in the description. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good afternoon. The first item of business this afternoon is Time for Reflection. Our Time for Reflection leader today is Dr. Yahya Bari, Imam Shah Jalal Mosque. Dr. Bari.
Presiding Officer, members of the Scottish Parliament, dear people of Scotland, we are living in a time of polarisation and division. Among the greatest risks we face as a society are misinformation, disinformation, and the loss of trust in one another. There is also fear, the fear of getting it wrong. Yet our moral compass, our inner voice of right and wrong, remains as clear as it was in our childhood innocence. We were born into a world full of trials, but also full of potential. The potential to rise, to reconcile, and to renew. As a black African Muslim, Gambian-born, London-raised, Saudi-educated Swedish national who calls Scotland home, I see in this land something profoundly hopeful. Its breathtaking beauty, the warmth of its people, and its courageous civic spirit that opens participation to all. Here in Scotland, I serve as an imam, yet I also work in film and TV. I've worked in the museum sector and the creative industries. I've seen that one's identity doesn't need to be boxed in. We all have the capacity to contribute meaningfully. From my Islamic tradition, two concepts speak clearly to this moment. The first is sincerity. The Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, said, "Ad-din an-nasiha," which means religion is sincere counsel. True faith calls us to be sincere in our advice, especially to those in leadership. So let this moment be a witness that within this heart of mine rests a prayer, a sincere hope, and good wishes for all gathered here, and for the nation that we share. May it flourish in justice, peace, and goodness. We are one humanity, not only by proximity or law, but by shared values, common concerns, and our yearning to live with meaning and purpose. The second is justice. Indeed, God commands you to uphold justice and excellence. This is in my theology. My theology teaches me this principle that divine support, victory, protection, blessing is granted to the just, regardless of their creed. That's what I believe. Justice is not the exclusive claim of one religion or community. It is the divine measure by which all communities are assessed. And so I say with hope, as long as you, the leaders of this land, continue to uphold justice, you need not fear anything. You have every reason to hope for God's aid, victory, and blessing. So may Scotland continue to be a beacon of dignity, fairness, and hope, and may each of us carry forward this duty with humility, courage, sincerity, and grace.
Thank you. And the next item of business is topical questions. Question number 1, I call Martin Whitfield.
I'm very grateful to Deputy Presiding Officer to ask the Scottish Government what its position is on whether its current investment in youth work is sufficient in light of reports of an increase in youth violence and the loss of local youth services in recent years.
Minister Graham Day.
The Scottish Government continues to fund youth work in a variety of ways, including through the block grant given to local authorities, affording them significant autonomy in allocating resources for youth work in their area. Recognising the important role local authorities play, the Government is increasing the resources available to local government in 25-26 by over £1.1 billion. In addition, the Scottish Government provides targeted funding to the youth sector via the Cashback for Communities programme. Since its inception, the programme has committed £156 million to supporting around 1.4 million young people across all 32 local authorities in Scotland.
Martin Whitfield.
I'm grateful to the Minister for that response. And first, can I just express my deepest sympathies to the families and communities that have been affected recently by youth violence across the whole of Scotland. Given that respected organisations such as YouthLink Scotland have reported over 20 million in cuts specifically to youth work services since 2016, does the Minister accept that this reduction in provision has directly weakened the support network that so many young people rely on, particularly those most at risk?
Minister.
Presiding Officer, let me first of all associate myself with Martin Whitfield's initial remarks. It is of course a fact that youth services are not run by the Scottish Government. As I've outlined to him, however, there is substantial funding going into local government to protect those services, and of course the additional monies that are provided by Cashback for Communities.
Martin Whitfield.
I'm grateful. It's disappointing that the Minister is unaware of the specific amount that's spent on youth work. But does the Minister recognise that youth work currently lacks any formal legal status in Scotland, leaving it even vital local services at risk of being cut or deprioritised? And in that context, given the overwhelming support from the sector and the Scottish Youth Parliament for my proposed Youth Work Scotland bill, which will enshrine youth work in law, will the Minister meet with me to discuss the fundamental importance of youth work in tackling not just youth violence, but also its role in our children and young people's lives?
Minister.
Well, as already outlined to Martin Whitfield, it's the evidence of the importance the Scottish Government places on youth work is there in the funding that is provided, first of all, at local government and by other means. But of course, I'll be delighted to meet Martin Whitfield.
Thank you. Supplementary. Audrey Nicholl.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I wonder if the Minister can further outline some of the very good work and important work that the Scottish Government has supported through youth work projects and through the Cashbacks programme that specifically supports young people on diversion against crime and antisocial behaviour, and also the consequences of violence and carrying weapons, including knives.
Minister. And officer, I think it's also important, and I should have said this earlier, because I know Martin Whitfield didn't mean to imply this, but the vast majority of young people, those who engage with youth work and those who don't, are law-abiding citizens. They would not indulge in the kind of behaviours that he's rightly pointed out. And I know he didn't mean to imply that. Phase 6 of cashback has run 23 to 26 and funds various projects including youth work, employability support, creative arts and sports projects. And additionally, the Government has provided over £2 million of funding over the past 3 years for community-based youth work through national third sector youth work organisations to reach young people outside of school.
Sharon Dowie.
Thank you. The Minister needs to take responsibility for the cuts his government has made to youth work at the same time as serious assaults by teenagers have increased by 600%. YouthLink Scotland's CEO says there is a direct link between the number of council youth workers in Scotland falling by 50% in 8 years on the SNP's watch and the increase in youth crime. Does the Minister agree with him?
Minister. Presiding Officer, on the point of accepting responsibility, I think it ill behoves a Conservative member of Parliament to stand up here today and talk about cuts in funding when they would, had they got their way, have utterly slashed the Scottish Government. Between 700 million and £1 billion, as I remember, and I suspect Sharon Dowie supported that position. I make the point once again. It is local government that delivers these services. Local government has had an uplift in its funding, contrary to what the Conservatives would have had us do, and the responsibility sits there. But of course, as I've said to Martin Whitfield, I fully recognise the importance of local government, and I'll be delighted to meet with him to discuss his bill.
And Alex Cole-Hamilton.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Young people are exponentially more likely to be victims of antisocial behaviour rather than perpetrators of it. And having worked for YouthLink for 4 years, having been a volunteer youth worker for nearly 20 years, I have seen the transformative effect that detached and sessional youth work can have with young people in our communities. But Martin Whitfield's absolutely right. The sector has been decimated by £20 million worth of cuts by the government, but it's a double-edged sword as well. The reduction in workforce caused by us not training community education workers anymore, or the decline in volunteering since lockdown has seen a massive impact on the sector too. What more can the government do to encourage people into youth work in the first place?
Minister.
I think Alex Cole-Hamilton makes a very good point at the end. It is a very important line of work, and I'm happy to take that away and consider it, because in terms of prioritisation of encouraging particularly young people into particular work streams, I think there is more that we can do. But again, I go back to the point, it is not the Scottish Government that is cutting the funding. That is a choice of local government.
Question 2, Liam Kerr.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the Scottish Government what its response is to reports that violence against teachers in schools in Aberdeen has risen by 25% in the last year.
Cabinet Secretary Jenny Goruth.
Scotland's classrooms should be safe and consistent learning environments for all. In August, the Scottish Government published our joint action plan with COSLA on relationships and behaviour in schools, which includes actions to reduce violence in schools. The plan is jointly owned with local government in recognition of the shared legal responsibilities of national and local government, as they have responsibility for addressing concerns in specific local authority areas in terms of being the employer of school staff. In the coming weeks, we will publish new guidance to support school staff in responding to behaviour, including the use of consequences. We will also be publishing new guidance on developing risk assessments for violent, aggressive or dangerous behaviour.
Liam Kerr.
Yeah, I thank the Cabinet Secretary for that answer, but the violence and abuse in our schools is not new, but it is constant. Indeed, in the North East, we've just seen truly terrifying examples in recent weeks at Hazelhead and Lawrence Kirk. But of course, councils and authorities in COSLA have a role, but solutions which lie at government level have been proposed by countless people, including in the debate that I led in March 2024 by the EIS in the November 23 report, and recently teachers themselves. So which of these government-located solutions has the government fully implemented since all of these reports?
Cabinet Secretary.
I thank the member for his interest in this issue, and of course we have debated this topic at length when he served in a previous position. There have been a range of different progress in terms of the action we've taken as a government. Since November 23 and March 25, we've made good progress against all 20 of the actions that are set out within the Behaviour Action Plan. That includes new guidance on addressing gender-based violence in schools, which we know is increasingly challenging, and updated our guidance on mobile phones and on anti-bullying. There has also been enhanced evidence gathering on relationships and behaviour as part of the school inspection process. The member may recall I discussed this at length in a previous debate, and the Chief Inspector has been leading that work. At the end of inspection, that feedback highlights key strengths and areas for improvement, and it also helps to support our schools on reflecting and enhancing their approaches to promoting positive relationships and managing behaviour. We've also had the development of professional learning being available to staff in schools on relationships and behaviour, and over the next year we will deliver a number of actions to support our schools, young people and their families, and I will give an update to Parliament further in relation to the work on consequences before the end of this term.
Liam Kerr.
Well, despite so many voices begging the government to get a handle on this and the reams of paper and warm words, violence in Scottish schools has been rising for years. Now, the Cabinet Secretary has referred a number of times to the behaviour plan that was published 10 months ago. Yet the NASUWT state it is having little impact. And in fact, the number of pupils being physically abusive and violent in schools has increased in the last 12 months. So, Cabinet Secretary, what resources for councils, schools and other relevant agencies are budgeted specifically to deliver the action plan when the consequences section is published? And what does she say that the statistics on violence in Scottish schools will be as a result of her plan by this time next year?
Cabinet Secretary.
I thank the member for his question. He raised a number of points. He referenced the NASUWT, who of course I look forward to meeting with at one of my regular bilaterals later today. The issue he raises in terms of impact is an issue I've discussed with them at length, and as a result of that, I wrote earlier this year actually with the Councillor Tony Buchanan from COSLA jointly to all directors of education to encourage information and awareness raising with head teachers, because we need that national action plan to help inform better approaches in our schools. He talks about the increase in relation to the figures. I note the issues in relation to Aberdeen. He will also recall that in late 2023 I was very clear in Parliament, and I have been since, that we want to encourage our staff to report incidents, and we know through the Behaviour in Scotland Schools research there has been a reticence in the past for staff to report. The member raises issues in relation to funding, and of course he also will recall I announced funding in 2023 of £900,000 to help provide support to our staff, and of course the Scottish Government's budget provided extra funding for more teachers in our school and additional support needs.
Thank you. Supplementary, Bill Kidd.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Cabinet Secretary, any violent incident against a teacher is unacceptable, and we must do all we can to reinforce the importance of behaving respectfully at school and in the community. The Cabinet Secretary, do you also agree that the vast majority of children and young people do behave respectfully, and as pupils reach the end of the school year and start to transition into the next, with many young people having overcome stressful experience in exams, we should actually say thank you to young people and highlight our appreciation of who they are and what they contribute to our lives and our society?
All through the Chair. Cabinet Secretary.
Presiding Officer, I would agree with the member's point, and I do wish to say thank you to our young people who have had an extremely challenging few years in relation to their education being disrupted by the pandemic. We know that's having an impact in our schools. We do need to remember, as I think Mr Day made in response to a previous question, that the vast majority of our young people, just like adults, do behave well and are a credit to their schools and society, and they should not be tarnished due to the behaviour of a minority. That's confirmed by our Behaviour in Scottish Schools research, which found that the majority of staff said children were well behaved most or all of the time. And I have had the privilege as Cabinet Secretary of visiting many schools across the country, and I'm always really impressed by the young people I meet. So while I do not deny the challenges we face with relationships and behaviour, particularly post-COVID, I've always been clear that we should not demonise our young people who need our support.
Stephen Kerr.
Does the comments from the Justice Secretary at the weekend on broadcast reflect the official position of the Education Secretary or the First Minister, that violent children should remain in mainstream classrooms? If that is the policy, was it agreed with teachers and their unions? And if it's not the policy, will the Cabinet Secretary take this opportunity to apologise to Scotland's teachers and parents and pupils for the confusion and the concern these comments have caused?
Cabinet Secretary.
I'm not cited on the specific commentary that Mr Kerr is alluding to, but I think the general point that has been made and was made in First Minister's questions, I think, last week and by the Justice Secretary, is that schools are sometimes the safest place for some of our young people who come from chaotic and challenging backgrounds. So it's important that schools offer that provision of consistent support. More broadly, though, the member and I have discussed over a number of months, not years, some of the challenges in Scotland's schools and how we can better provide that support to our frontline staff. I think that's hugely important. I mentioned in response to Mr Kerr the extra funding we're putting in through the budget for teacher numbers, for additional support needs. These things make a difference at the chalk face, but it's also imperative that the National Action Plan, which I spoke to previously, helps to inform improved practice in our schools, which is why we're working in conjunction with COSLA to do exactly that.
Anna Regan.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Experienced educators, including a retired Edinburgh head teacher who I met with this morning, track the root cause of escalating violence in schools to the erosion of clear, unambiguous, values-based behavioural policies based on consequences. So will the government now admit the failure of over-reliance on restorative approaches that have eroded behaviour in our schools and now fully commit to urgently restoring clear behavioural expectations with consequences to protect the safety of our teachers and pupils and raise attainment?
Cabinet Secretary.
I'm not sure I would associate myself with the comments from Ms Regan in relation to a values-based education system. I think we have very much a values-based education system in Scotland. It is one that's rooted in social justice, and that is encapsulated by our approach in relation to curriculum for excellence. There are consequences for young people in our schools, much as there might be consequences for MSPs in this chamber, presiding officer, in relation to behaviour. So I think it is appropriate that we engage directly with head teachers and listen to them accordingly. I have not seen the commentary from the head teacher the member alluded to. I'm more than happy to engage with her on that point if she's able to share more information with my office.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. That concludes topical questions. There will be a brief pause to allow front benches to change before we move to the next item of business. Okay, the next item of business is a debate on motion 17648 in the name of Gillian Martin on growing community-owned energy in Scotland. I'd invite members wishing to participate in the debate to press the request to speak buttons. I do note that a number of members who had indicated they wish to speak in the debate are not in the chamber, which is more than disappointing. And I call on Gillian Martin to speak to and move the motion. Cabinet Secretary, around 15 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I'm grateful for the opportunity to open today's debate and to shine an important spotlight on community-owned energy in Scotland. The Scottish Government is committed to growing our economy in a way that also ends our contribution to climate change, and our drive to bring down our emissions comes with a huge potential for wealth creation, not least in our communities. To deliver a just transition, we must continue to work with communities, businesses, industry and the people of Scotland to plan for a future where Scotland is a leader in low-emission systems and technologies, with all the jobs and reduction in the cost of living that can come from that. It's essential that our communities reap the benefit of this transition. This transition is about both the outcome, a fairer, greener, more resilient and prosperous future, and the way we get there in partnership with our citizens, understanding and accepting the reasons why this is a priority for the nation's health, well-being and a vibrant future economy for us and our children for decades to come. Community energy plays a particularly important role in empowering communities to take ownership of their energy future. Communities owning their own their own wind, solar and other renewable projects puts them at the centre of this revolution in power generation, while bringing in valuable revenue that can be directed towards community priorities, such as tackling fuel poverty or upgrading local infrastructure and supporting community events. The Scottish Government has a long history of supporting the delivery of more community-led renewable energy, energy demand reduction and energy supply projects. And the impact of community energy over time is demonstrated by the work of the Point and Sandwich Trust on the Isle of Lewis. This project began as a public discussion in 2005 on the possibility of developing a large community-owned wind farm on common grazing grounds. The project developed from there, and with support from CARES loan, that's Community and Renewable Energy Scotland scheme loan. By 2015, installation was completed and the turbines were energised, becoming one of the biggest community wind farms in the whole of the UK. Today, the community-owned wind farm produces around £900,000 a year in net income for the local community. And once capital costs have been repaid, it's expected to generate up to £2 million a year. These funds support projects in and around the local area, providing valuable benefits to the community. And the Scottish Government is determined to build on these community energy successes with our new Community Energy Generation Growth Fund, which will provide up to £8 million to boost community energy in Scotland. This includes £4 million which the Scottish Government has secured from GB Energy to support community and local energy in Scotland, alongside £4 million of Scottish Government funding. This programme for government commitment will help grow the pipeline of community energy in Scotland, enabling more communities to see the benefit of owning their own renewable energy projects. And this is a significant expansion on last year's community energy pilot, and will help to deliver social and financial benefits from the energy transition directly into Scotland's communities. I will.
Maurice Golden.
Thank the member for taking intervention. I wonder if there's any consideration being given to how benefits are spread to those communities that might not be located next to a large wind farm, for example, but might be very much in need of investment, and indeed the consumers are paying for some of the transmission from that wind farm.
Cabinet Secretary.
I think there's a number of things at play here. The member will be aware that after a great deal of encouragement from the Scottish Government, the UK Government has put out a consultation on community benefits from developments that are happening in renewables. So that's one area in which communities can benefit. But of course, in terms of community energy projects, there is obviously the option for developers to be going to communities and offering that as a solution to, or maybe an offer as part of their good neighbour principle as well. But even if that doesn't happen in an area, there is the ability for communities to come together and to contact the Community and Renewable Energy Scotland and ask for advice on how they can actually build their own system and community energy plant of whatever description. And I think that the CARES model has shown to be very, very successful, so much so that that's one of the reasons that I asked the UK Government to take money from the local power plan and put it into CARES rather than setting up a new agency. So, yes, I will.
Patrick Harvey.
I'm grateful. The Cabinet Secretary is setting out very clearly the reasons why community ownership has significant benefits, and I think there's very little dissent from that principle. But renewable energy has been growing dramatically for many years in Scotland, and if the model that's been pursued so far has been a success, why does the Cabinet Secretary think we don't see a much more significant share of the overall renewable energy industry being in community, public or shared hands? Why do we have this very private sector dominated industry?
Cabinet Secretary.
I think there's a number of reasons. I think one of the reasons historically was that communities felt that they almost had to be engineers and actually have somebody in their community who was an expert on this. And that's one of the reasons that we set up CARES, to be able to share the information with communities as to how to take forward projects. We're 55% towards our target of renewable community energy generation by 2030. And in large part, that there has been a real step change in the amount of projects because of CARES. Of course, there are still other barriers. I'm going to mention them in the other parts of the speech. There's a lot that we can still be doing to bring down the barriers. I think that Patrick Harvey is absolutely right. What I want to see is any of the barriers towards communities even taking forward these projects are looked at and eliminated as much as possible. So I want to just mention the Community Generation Growth Fund, the £8 million that will boost community energy. It's a significant expansion on last year's community energy pilot. And I think that, going back to Patrick Harvey's point, we have seen success with the money that the funding that has been given to CARES, and actually working with communities and getting them to overcome some of those barriers. That's why we did the pilot, and that's why we've put the additional £8 million into it. It will support community groups across Scotland to develop their own projects. Wind, solar PV projects and applications for funding are now open and will close on the 25th of June. And full funding guidance, including information on how to apply, can be found on the Local Energy Scotland website. And indeed, there will be a list of the people in the area that are the Local Energy Scotland officials that communities can get in touch with in first instance. Yes.
Mike Rowley. For the Minister to take intervention. Does the Minister believe that, or the Cabinet Secretary believes that, local councils have an important role to play in supporting community organisations.
Cabinet Secretary.
It's the essence of community wealth building and community empowerment that local authorities work with those in their community who want to actually take forward some of the opportunities in having community-owned energy. And I know a lot of local councillors have dedicated officials, particularly in the community empowerment space, who will be able to assist. But also, of course, CARES is an absolute vital resource as well. And the Local Energy Scotland website, as I said, will have named individuals for each area that communities can pick up the phone or they could email, and then they can start making that contact with them as well. And that's proven to be very, very helpful. The pilot last year, the Growth Fund pilot, supported a wide range of activities, including feasibility studies, securing grid connections, planning and installation and build costs. Ireland Community Renewables received almost £500,000 to help develop their community solar project, and CARES funding supported vital work on grid connection, planning application and project management costs. The project's now been granted planning consent for a 6-megawatt solar farm, which will be wholly owned by the community and will contribute to a benefit fund for the island. And once complete, it will become Scotland's biggest community-owned solar farm. And it's been reported that it will produce enough renewable energy to meet up to 1/4 of the island's domestic power needs. Another project in Wallistown in South Ayrshire demonstrates the positive impacts that community energy groups can bring to the local area. Community identified 3 publicly owned school buildings in Wallistown to host solar PV panels on their roofs, and CARE support has allowed them to progress through the pre-installation phase, and the installation is due to begin this summer. The project plans to generate energy that will be used within the schools that are hosting these solar panels, will offset their energy costs, and with surplus electricity going back into the grid. And income raised from that will then be used by the community to help those within the community that are feeling the worst impacts of fuel poverty. The project is also committed to community building and education, and this began with Newton Primary School, whose students designed the logo for the project. All 3 schools have had the opportunity to learn about the solar panels that will be at their schools, with photovoltaic kits provided to them. And I imagine that there will be quite a lot of the renewables engineers of the future coming from these schools as a result. Wouldn't that be nice to see? The project has already been recognised by the University of Strathclyde of one of the Community Challenge projects, and students have also undertaken a group project to support the development of the proposed plan, Wallistown as a net zero village. And that's what CARES is all about. Supporting communities to participate in, drive and benefit from the energy transition to net zero emissions, to see the real benefits of the renewable energy sector. We are determined to ensure that all communities from the most rural in Scotland... Yes, I will.
Finlay Carson.
I very much appreciate you giving way. Can I ask what protection your plans give to communities that don't want any more wind or any more battery storage?
Through the Chair, always, Cabinet Secretary.
This debate is about communities that want to have their own community owned schemes rather than anything to do with planning or consents. So I think that if the member wanted to write to me about specific concerns around planning and consents for developments, that is a separate subject. I'm happy to answer all these questions on that, but I am concentrating on community energy, which is proving to be such a boost for the communities that take forward these projects. Community energy also has a role to play in supporting off-grid communities such as Knoydart Peninsula. Knoydart is not connected to the national electricity grid and generates all its own electricity through a single hydroelectric turbine. Knoydart Renewables Limited, or KRL, supplies most of the energy in Knoydart and is responsible for maintaining a 28-kilowatt hydropower system. And CARES recently provided funding to refurbish Knoydart's hydropower scheme. This work means it will be able to meet the peak power requirements for the community for another 40+ years, and has allowed new properties to be built and are connected to the island electrical network. These projects, led by a wide range of communities with different geographies and priorities, demonstrate the impact that community energy can have. However, community energy is not the only way that our communities can secure benefits from the energy transition. And I want to reflect on Maurice Golden's question to me. Shared ownership, where communities take a share in a commercial renewable energy project, can also offer communities significant opportunities, and we are committed to supporting communities to access this opportunity. CARES offers support for communities that are looking to invest in shared ownership, providing free-to-use online guidance and resources. The scheme can also help communities to access funding and contractors for project management, financial matters, legal matters, and ensure that they all have the information to decide if the ownership is right for them. I will do.
Very much welcome the Cabinet Secretary outlining that support. Would she agree with me that we also should be thinking about support for local authorities so that they could be a pioneer in Scotland, because we have very few local authority schemes at the moment?
Cabinet Secretary, I'll give you the time back for some of these interventions.
I am open to any suggestions which would mean that we have more local authority schemes. And if there's any barriers in the way, I'd like to investigate with particular local authorities what they are. And I will come on to the Labour amendment to the motion in a minute, Ms Boyack, because I think there's some opportunities for discussion there. But also progressing the work on the commitment to the onshore wind sector deal to publish a framework of practical approaches to support and encourage community shared ownership models. And this will assist communities, developers and funders to engage in shared ownership opportunities. And the UK Government recently published a working paper seeking views on the current voluntary approach to community shared ownership and barriers to the uptake of shared ownership. And I would encourage all members to look at that, it's a consultation of sorts, and publicise that to their communities. And we will consider the proposals in detail to ensure they consider Scottish communities and give them the chance to benefit from investing in commercially owned renewable energy projects. And I'll come to the Labour amendment, which we will be supporting. The Scottish Government are also committed to exploring ways that we can maximise the opportunities offered by the sustainable procurement duty. This will support the development of sustainably sourced energy in Scotland, and where possible how we can incorporate locally sourced energy into the electricity supplied via our National Framework Agreement for electricity. The current framework agreement for the supply of electricity is due to expire in March 2029. And so we will ensure that the next generation framework agreement reflects the desire of the public sector in Scotland to maximise the opportunities offered by power purchase agreements. Presiding Officer, I will conclude. Through community energy and shared ownership, as well as community benefits and the wider economic benefits from renewables, we are absolutely committed to maximising the benefits the communities see from renewable energy. Community energy supports our net zero ambitions, but it does more than that. It puts communities at the heart of the energy transition, empowering them to support their own priorities and reflecting each community's long-term needs and aspirations in a way that is just and fair. And the 8 million Community Energy Growth Fund will mean that there will be more action in this area. And I look forward to participating in the debate on such an important topic, and I move the motion in my name, Presiding Officer.
Thank you very much, Cabinet Secretary. Just to advise the Chamber we've got a bit of time in hand, so members taking interventions will certainly get the time back. I call Douglas Lumsden to speak to and move Amendment 17648.3. Around 11 minutes.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and I move the amendment in my name, and I think there's going to be a lot we agree on this afternoon, because community-owned energy is fast becoming an increasingly important element in our energy production in Scotland. Local power production schemes are fast becoming a means by which our more rural communities are becoming energy efficient and less reliant on more carbon-intensive means of energy production. They serve to bring autonomy to our rural communities, give them a stake in their energy production, sustainability in environmental terms, and resilience for when the main grid fails due to weather or other calamities. And I want to join with the Cabinet Secretary in recognising the work that's been done by Community Energy Scotland. I've spoken to many community groups who speak highly of the support, advice and guidance given to them by this agency, and the support and advice they have given to MSPs in terms of meeting with us and patiently explaining some of their ambitions and frustrations for community energy production throughout Scotland. Rarely have I heard such warm words said of a government body, and so I do want to recognise that in my remarks today. We know that 1.1 gigawatts of community and local-owned renewable energy capacity has been in operation in Scotland in December 2024, and that the Government has a target of 2 gigawatts by 2030, a laudable target, although this SNP's record of achieving targets in environmental issues has not been great so far. But, Presiding Officer, I will suspend my pessimism on this occasion. However, Community Energy Scotland want the Government to distinguish between local and community-owned and solely community-owned. They want to see a separate target of 1 gigawatt of energy per year produced by community schemes, as well as the 2 gigawatt of local and community schemes set by the Government. And while this may seem like a small change, this is fundamental to ensuring that these schemes are indeed run for and by communities, rather than larger companies who take the benefit without ensuring community support. It would also enable us to access additional funding from the UK Government, who are focused on delivering 8 gigawatts of community energy by 2030. By bringing us into line with that target, we can achieve a lot more rather than the usual SNP mantra of being different for different sake. And while I'm speaking about the relationship with the Labour Government, I do want to pick up on one announcement made by both governments and claimed as their own. Now, I know we're talking about an £8 million scheme. Now, I believe it's £4 million from the UK Government through GB Energy and £4 million from the SNP Government. I would really like to make sure that's clarified, and if it is £4 million from the Scottish Government, whether that's actually new money or whether it's just been repurposed from another budget line. I'll give way to the Cabinet Secretary on that.
Cabinet Secretary.
So I can confirm that this is shared funding from both governments. It's not been repurposed, it's new money. It's the expansion to the capacity of CARES off the back of the pilot work that we did.
Douglas Lumsden. I thank the Cabinet Secretary for that clarification, because it is important, because often we hear funds that have went from one place to another. So it is good to hear that it's actually new money. But communities will wait to see what benefit this money actually brings in terms of money, inward investment and economic benefit to our rural communities. My pessimism has well and truly returned when it comes to the jobs promised by GB Energy, promised 1,000, but that's going to take years and years. Because at the heart of all these announcements are small local communities who see the potential in small local energy schemes. They want to do their bit. They see an opportunity, they have the drive and passion to take it forward, but find it an incredibly daunting process. There is little in the government motion that suggests that it will be easier in the future, just that more money might be available. The community groups that I have spoken to highlight some key challenges when it comes to getting schemes from idea to delivery. These were picked up in a report from Climate Exchange in 2024 that found 3 main barriers: a lack of resources, a lack of skills and a lack of community input. And nothing that the Cabinet Secretary has said today will change any of those things. Firstly, a lack of resources. Taking a project from idea to execution can take 5 years or more. For a community group, that is a huge commitment of time and resources that few can commit to. And money won't necessarily make a difference to this requirement, although it may allow groups to buy in expertise when they need to. But these are often volunteer groups of committed individuals who have busy, changing lives. Personnel can change frequently, and it's difficult for them to see a project through, given the amount of time that is required to simply fill in all the paperwork required. Secondly, a lack of skills. And here the report is specifically referring to the lack of skills within local authorities to spearhead local projects. The report states that local authority stakeholders note that there is still often a lack of skill for local energy projects in general. This is in addition, of course, to a lack of expertise in local communities. Thirdly, a lack of community input. I'll give way to Audrey Nicholl.
Audrey Nicholl.
I thank the member for giving way. I understand the point that the member is making about skills and knowledge, but I have to say, as a constituency MSP, I've had quite a number of, for example, retired engineers from the oil and gas sector coming to discuss potential projects right across the renewable space with me. So I'm just putting it out there to make the member aware.
Douglas Lumsden.
Absolutely agree with Audrey Nicholl, and this is where it depends on people with lots of skills. But because the process is so long, they're not always there for the whole duration of the. I'll give way to Christine Graham.
Christine Graham.
I never thought I'd hear myself saying, but I agree with Douglas Lumsden. I do think it is quite difficult for certain communities to navigate their way through the processes that are before us. And I think that in areas where people are less privileged, it must be extremely difficult to benefit from these. So I do agree with you.
Douglas Lumsden. Absolutely. And, if there's more that we can do, if there's more help that we can give our local authorities to help that process, then I think that would be a good thing. And thirdly, there's a lack of community input. Often local energy projects are not community projects, a point I made earlier, and can lack in community input. Companies or housing developers are acting locally to develop schemes, but not including the views of the local community in those plans. And I mentioned previously the time that it takes for energy schemes to go through the planning process. The planning process for a small community wind farm is the same one for a major wind farm. The planning process for a small hydro scheme or small tidal scheme is the same as a big scheme. There is no proportionality in our planning system within our local authorities. So the Scottish Conservatives want to see local communities having much more say over energy projects in their area, and also much more proportionate planning guidance for community-owned schemes. And I wonder if the Cabinet Secretary agrees with me that this is an area that should be considered by the Government in the future. And the motion focuses on generation. But what about energy storage? Why not encourage more community ownership of energy storage? We are seeing an explosion in battery storage. Most of these are being pushed through against the local wishes of our local communities. It is seen as a gold rush, with developers rushing in to make a fortune, buying cheap energy and then selling it for a fortune when the wind is not blowing. There seems to be little regulation and lack of controls. So if these sites are being inflicted on communities against their will, why not give communities a stake? So it's not just the energy finance companies who benefit, local communities can benefit also. Now, I've spent much of my time today looking at the government motion, which I note none of the amendments I've sought to amend, only add to. And I want to address the main point of our amendment, and that is of how the energy is transferred into the grid. As part of its pathway to 2030, SSEN is proposing to build 500 kilometres of monster pylons throughout some of the most scenic areas of Scotland. And Scottish Power are also planning an 80-kilometre route through the borders of Scotland, an almost as scenic part. And Deeside Against Pylon spokesman John Rax has said our communities feel that the north of Scotland is bearing a disproportionate cost for this short-sighted proposal, which is driven by cost. Tracy Smith of Save Our Marne said SSEN were bulldozing through the North East. And we recently had a debate in this chamber bringing Scotland into line with the Aarhus Convention, calling for legal aid for communities and an environmental court to give communities a greater say when it comes to these kind of developments. But the Cabinet Secretary seems to think we're in compliance with our House Convention now. And I asked the Cabinet Secretary this morning about changes to the Planning and Infrastructure Bill and how it will affect communities. Community groups have written in and said they will no longer take part in Scottish Government consultations as they feel ignored. One response from Scotland Against Spin said, "We are not going to waste our time making the same arguments that have already been ignored once and which will no doubt be ignored again." I'll take the intervention.
Cabinet Secretary.
I said this to Mr Lumsden this morning, is that the changes to the legislative consent motion actually mandates community engagement, whereas at the moment it's voluntary. So it actually is putting in law the need for companies, developers and transmission owners to be engaging with communities in law.
Douglas Lumsden.
Once again, the Cabinet Secretary takes bits from that she likes, but fails to ignore the other places. Taking away the right to public inquiry, removing the time limit down. So this devolved government should hang their head in shame when we have campaign groups feel ignored as government ministers.
Could you resume your seat a second? Point of order, Cabinet Secretary.
The record will show this morning that I said in committee the right to a public inquiry stays, and Mr Lumsden is deliberately misleading the chamber.
Cabinet Secretary, could I ask you perhaps to rephrase that last comment, please?
From what Mr Lumsden has said, I fear that he has not taken on board the facts that I have laid out this morning at committee.
Thank you. It wasn't a point of order, but anyway, Douglas Lumsden to continue.
I'm sure everyone knows that the right to an automatic public inquiry is being removed from our local communities. That's what's set out in the new legislation that's coming through. Shamefully so, shamefully so. And this devolved government should hang their head in shame. Campaign groups are feeling ignored. That's what it's coming to, as government ministers refuse to meet with them, but happy enough to cozy up with developers. It's a David versus Goliath situation. And that is why the proposed time limit reduction from 3 months to 6 weeks to lodge an objection to onshore energy is a disgrace. The Cabinet Secretary cares more about pleasing renewable energy companies than standing up for local communities. So we will make that call again and ask the Scottish Government when they are going to not only put more money into community schemes, but actually solve the systematic issues that are preventing communities from standing up to large-scale developments that are ruining our countryside. The Scottish Conservatives want to see our local communities empowered to grow energy schemes in a proportionate way, with sensible planning and community buy-in to the process. We want to see them properly funded and assisted to not only propose schemes that are advantageous to local communities, but oppose schemes that are detrimental to them. We do not want to see monster pylons littering our countryside with little regard for local concerns, scenery, agricultural or economic growth. It's time for this devolved government to listen to communities and not sideline them to appease the renewable energy companies' chums. Thank you, Presiding Officer.
Thank you. I now call Sarah Boyack to speak to and move Amendment 17648.1. Around 9 minutes. Ms Boyack.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. First of all, I want to welcome today's debate because I think it's an absolutely crucial issue for us to be debating. And as a Labour and cooperative member, I am actually very proud to be a member of the Edinburgh Solar Co-op, and I'm going to come back to that later. I think this debate is not just a nice to have. It's absolutely key in maximising our fantastic land and wind and water resources to benefit communities. But more than that, it's also about empowering our local communities. It should also be about creating local jobs and investment and about delivering community wealth building. And if we get it right, if we have effective planning, we potentially also tackle our nature and climate emergencies. So this is absolutely crucial. I want to start off also by welcoming the fact that the Scottish Government is going to support our Scottish Labour amendment today. I constructed it as an add amendment. My aim was to be constructive, although if you read our amendment, it's about where we need to go much further. So I want to focus on that today. I think there is so much more that needs to be done and can be done to ensure that we have more community-owned, cooperatively owned and municipally owned projects that can actually be delivered. And I think one of the points that Douglas Lumsden made that I totally agree with is the huge amount of time it takes for individual communities to do this work. It's not just a year or two. It's committing to years and years of getting a project through, working up the financial side of it, working up the investment side, getting it through planning, and then actually running the project. So it's a huge commitment, but actually we shouldn't underestimate the challenge for local authorities as well, because they have had lots of cuts to their funding and they don't have the dedicated staff. And we need to make sure we can learn from the success that there has been in those areas where we've had community projects in Scotland owned by authorities, and how we make sure that can get spread through working with COSLA and individual local authorities, because the geography of our local authorities in Scotland means that they all have opportunities, but there are risks that need to be assessed, there's investment that's needed, and there's skills that officers need, and that needs more sharing. And that's why I mentioned working with carers. It's also looking at, I think, Cooperative Development Scotland. What more could it do to share best practice? So there's lots that needs to be done. And one of the reasons I think we need to focus on why this has to happen is the discussion about having a joined-up approach. At the Net Zero Committee last month, we discussed the issue of constraint payments. Last year, £393 million were paid on constraint payments last year. That's when you have to turn wind farm turbines off, and 98% of that money was because of wind turbines in Scotland. We need to be using that electricity now. So we need to think about creating local power. We also need to think about how we use that power. Now, there's powering electric vehicles, there's powering our buses, there's powering our trains. Yes, I'll take an intervention.
Maurice Golden.
In terms of increasing demand in order to reduce the amount of constraint payments, I wonder what the member's position is on an electric arc furnace here in Scotland.
Sarah Boyack.
I'm not going to begin to answer that question. Let's have a conversation about that afterwards, because what I was going to say next was the other area that I think we've not focused on enough in our communities is heat. Heat for our buildings, heat networks. So there's the capacity, and if we have more and more renewables, we need to think in a more joined-up way, and that could be pumped hydro storage, as well as providing sources to use that electricity. And that's why our amendment references the heat strategies. Local authorities submitted them last January, and there's an opportunity for us, huge opportunities for not-for-profit owned heat networks to keep prices affordable consumers, and with local authority or community ownership would also give us more accountability. And if you look at the best practice in Denmark, they've been doing this for decades, and through that time they've not just had heat networks owned by local authorities, they've also decarbonised, so it's a win-win that we're not making the most of. We have got examples. Aberdeen Heat and Power, established in 2002. I've visited it several times. If it was very brief.
Emma Harper.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I will be really brief and I pushed the wrong button. Does the member think that anaerobic digestion in terms of dairy farm byproducts and co-products which generate a lot of heat could be part of what we need to look at to help support agriculture to get to net zero?
Sarah Boyack.
There's all sorts of opportunities we're not currently maximising, and that's been part of the discussion at Net Zero Committee in terms of Project Willow at Grangemouth, more joined-up thinking in communities and nationally as well. The other example I was going to give was the Midlothian project at Shawfair, which is a joint venture partnership between Midlothian Energy Company and Vattenfall, and that will power 3,500 houses. Again, the council is leading, using the private sector to deliver, but there's accountability there. And we're not seeing that across the country, and that's because local authorities need to push down the cost of those projects. They need to share best practice, and they also need to make sure there's a joined-up approach. In the Lothians, for example, you've got that Midlothian project, and just to the other side of Edinburgh boundary, we've got East Lothian, huge amount of work being done in East Lothian, and then thinking about the work that's been done in Edinburgh City Council. We need a more joined-up approach, and I think it is very innovative. So I think both the Scottish Government and the UK Government should be thinking about how we get projects going and then use that best practice to share with other councils. I was at a Gala Shields event last month, and we were talking about Scotland beyond net zero. I've talked about urban areas. In rural areas, district heating can also be a win-win, using the electricity produced locally, but also then giving the councils the opportunity to use that electricity. And again, using that Denmark example. I also want to make the comment about the huge benefit from communities. I welcome the fact the Cabinet Secretary referenced Point and Sandwick. The STUC published stats today that say that community-owned wind farms benefit communities to a factor of times 34 compared with private-owned wind farms. We're missing out there. So that's why I welcome the extra money from both GB Energy and the Scottish Government. It's how we now spend that money, because the communities need support now, not in a couple of years. And it's not nice to have, it's critical. And the other things that need to happen, land reform, so that communities actually get the chance to have priority access to the land when it becomes available and can do their own projects. I know my colleague Rhoda Grant's been working on this. The other thing is the range of tech that you could use. I've mentioned wind, there's solar, there's hydro schemes, and that's right across urban and rural Scotland. And we should have a solar plan because we've got one for wind. We should have 2030 targets. I gave you the example of Edinburgh Solar Co-op. Why we don't have them across Scotland does not make sense to me, but it took years for the council to agree the project, and our schools and our leisure centres now have solar on the roofs. That's both good for the environment, also generates an income for the council. Why don't we have that across Scotland? Because it's too complicated, so we need to support local authorities. And it's not even about new buildings, you can actually retrofit existing buildings. So I'm glad the Cabinet Secretary is now talking about supporting our amendment, but I just wanted to highlight that that could be an additional factor that would help us to open up solar. And it could also be solar in rural communities alongside agriculture, which can now be more integrated and again could be community owned. But I go back to the next point I want to make, which is about the point that's critical, which is about procurement. Now, I've spoken to people who have set up community projects that cannot get access to the Scottish Government's electricity supply contract. So we need to reform procurement because there's a huge opportunity here. And one of my former colleagues, Alan Wilson's involved in a project, and he highlighted the absolute difference it would make to be able to access that opportunity to get access to procurement. It's a really big missed opportunity. It's a £700 million contract. Why can't communities actually get access to that project? And if the Minister would be supportive of this, I would be very keen to meet with her and discuss what the changes needed actually are, with the feedback I've had from local communities, because it's not a nice to have, it's a must have, and we need to have change there. So there's lots more that could be done. I am very keen that we actually get a constructive approach here today, because this is not nice to have. As one of the representatives from Point and Sandwich made absolutely clear, it is transformational in their community, but it's taken years and years. The last two things I would like to mention is, why don't we use the Scottish National Investment Bank? Why don't we think about using pension investment, long-term, safe investment? We need to be thinking about new investment opportunities, thinking about the National Wealth Fund that GB Energy has established. We need to make a case, because these projects will be successful over time. They're safe investment projects, but they need local authorities, cooperative opportunities, and they critically need communities empowered to actually make the most of these opportunities. So there's way more we need to do, and the Scottish Government's reached just over half its target by 2030. There's an awful lot more needs to be done in the next 4.5 years. If we're going to do that, the key issues we've identified in our amendment are how we might make that happen. So I therefore finish, Presiding Officer, by moving the amendment in my name. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms Boyack. I now call on Patrick Harvey to speak to move Amendment 17648.2, around 6 minutes. Mr Harvey.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Can I add my voice to the general welcome that's been expressed across the Chamber for this debate? And I do think that the nature of the amendments, well, they're not all coming from the same point of view, of course, but they are all seeking to add something to the motion rather than delete from it. And I think that that demonstrates that there is a degree of consensus, at least on what the Scottish Government does have to say, even if opposition parties think more needs to be said. Unlike the Conservative amendment, of course, the Labour and Green amendments both bring positive ideas to the table, and I think that's the intention behind both. I move the Green amendment in my name, which does set out some of the positive steps that I would argue need to be taken if we're going to maximise the public benefit, the environmental benefit, the social and the economic benefit of community-owned, publicly owned and shared and not-for-profit ownership of energy infrastructure. We are at a critical point in the energy transition, the transition to a sustainable energy system. We're at that point, though, at a point where also people are struggling with their energy bills. And political parties across the UK are, I think, beginning to be too willing to accept pushback against the idea of the energy transition. And some political parties are either heeding or in fact peddling the misinformation that's coming from anti-climate or anti-net zero voices, including those funded by the corporate fossil fuel giants. So we're at a pretty dangerous point in relation to how our political landscape is dealing with the energy transition. Most of the public do want climate action, and they do embrace a renewables future. But it's critically important for us to recognise the need to continue to earn and to reinforce that support for the urgency of the transition. To do that, we need to make sure that people get the benefit, and people are rightly cynical about the profit motive of an overwhelmingly privatised energy system. A key part of this energy transition must be not just about replacing the last century's dirty fossil fuel power generation with renewables. It's about rebalancing the ownership of our energy system, putting not just the power to generate electricity into communities, but putting the ownership of it into the hands of local communities. In short, we don't need to swap a bunch of fossil fuel multinationals for a set of renewable multinationals. The opportunity here is to transform ownership of our energy system and to transform the economic benefit as well. And none of this is new. None of this is rocket science. This is all stuff that other countries have done very successfully years, decades, even generations before us. Many other European countries have high levels of public ownership, community ownership and not-for-profit ownership of energy infrastructure. So I'm pleased that today's debate gives us the opportunity to focus on this, but we do need to recognise, as I said in my intervention on the Cabinet Secretary, that despite a long-term growth in renewables, which is extremely positive in its own right, we haven't seen a substantial part of that growing renewable sector being in community hands. I want to express thanks to Community Energy Scotland, the Scottish Community Coalition on Energy and Social Enterprise Scotland for their briefings in support of the debate. They make it clear that while some corporately owned, privately owned projects do make community benefit payments available, the benefit that comes from community ownership projects is many, many times more substantial than those community benefits. And all of the benefit that flows from such projects can be put back to social and environmental use in the community, providing a direct social benefit in addition to the direct benefit of increased renewable capacity, but also that change in relationship between people and the energy that we consume. And that's a cultural change that needs to be going hand in hand with the practical infrastructure changes if we're going to continue to earn, reinforce and retain public support. So there's a great deal that we need to do more of, both in terms of access to capital for new projects as well as for repowering existing projects, and publicly owned assets can be used to lever in that capital that's needed. But also, as several people have remarked already, making public land available for community energy. And public bodies who are responsible for managing large swathes of Scotland's public land, like Forestry and Land Scotland, already host large numbers of renewable energy projects, but few of them are community owned. They do have an opportunity to step in and increase the transfer of energy assets into community hands at the point of lease renewals. And a recent opportunity to do that on the Cowal Peninsula in Argyll and Bute was missed. Cowal Community Energy was not able to enter the tendering process that was designed to attract bids from corporate players. So when the Cabinet Secretary or the Minister respond to the debate, I hope that they'll respond on that particular issue. Are they aware of how that barrier came about, and what can they do to prevent those opportunities from being missed in the future? And the land reform, I'll give way,
Sarah Boyack.
I appreciate the member taking an intervention. I'm just looking at that issue in his amendment about diversifying the ownership of existing energy assets. Are you thinking about, for example, when repowering is taking place, a company thinking about maybe donating one or two of the turbines to the local community so that they can own those turbines? And you've got the example going way back of Fintry, where the local community negotiated an element of that wind farm. So it's not about nationalising projects, it's about having a share in projects and working constructively to give communities that opportunity.
Patrick Harvey, and give the time back.
Both repowering and lease renewal for land can be trigger points, can be opportunities to achieve that. I do think perhaps we need to go a little further than just encouraging the private sector maybe to donate a little and actually make it a requirement so that we do see a significant increase. I want to mention the land reform bill as well, which also has an opportunity to improve the situation, and I hope that we'll see changes at stages 2 and 3 to take advantage of that. Before I close, Presiding Officer, I do want to say something about heat as well, because the urban landscape also has huge opportunity for the transformation of our energy system. There's a real necessity to achieve that, and it creates some of the opportunity for benefits in areas that don't have access to, for example, wind power sites, wind farm sites. Denmark is 50 years ahead of us in Scotland, 50 years ahead of us, and they have shown that a non-profit approach can achieve the transformational change that they put in practice. It creates that community benefit, it puts community benefit first, but it can also earn and retain public support, and we need to do much more to make that a reality in Scotland. So the energy transformation that's required is not just about the rural communities. It is significant in those rural communities with wind, with solar, and with the need to retain public support for infrastructure rather than demonising infrastructure, as some seem tempted to do at the moment. But our urban landscape as well needs to transform, and the public and community ownership of energy infrastructure in our urban landscape is equally important. In closing, Presiding Officer, I'll once again express support for the Labour amendment. I hope that the Government is supportive of the Green amendment as well. And if I didn't do it earlier, I move the amendment in my name now.
Thank you, Mr Harvey. And I now call on Beatrice Wishart. Again, around 6 minutes. Ms Wishart.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I welcome the opportunity to speak on behalf of Scottish Liberal Democrats this afternoon. Last week, speaking in the Island Communities debate, I highlighted the feelings of those in Shetland who feel the Viking wind farm is not best serving the community interest. I said the irony is not lost in Shetland, where we see the Viking wind farm reportedly generating as little as 17% of its capacity and being paid enormous sums to constrain production as the energy infrastructure is not considered able to cope with higher generation. Those constraint payments reportedly reached almost £10 million by December 2024, dwarfing the Shetland Community Benefit Fund, which its website states administers just over £2.2 million annually. The feeling at home is that if we live with it, we should benefit from it, just as we did from agreements reached with the oil industry 50 years ago. While reaching our net zero targets are a benefit to all communities globally, locally, compensation payouts for years of disruptions have been overshadowed by a lack of foresight and infrastructure readiness as Viking's generating power is reduced. My Liberal Democrat Highland colleague MP Angus MacDonald has successfully shepherded party policy for plans for community benefits from renewables and held a debate in Westminster advocating for fair compensation to local communities who host renewable projects. Similarly, Shetland Islands councillors backed a new set of principles around community benefits to be used in future negotiations with energy developers earlier this year. Community buy-in is critical, and offshoring energy infrastructure, such as with wind turbines, has been heralded as a great opportunity. Often, however, such advocates should be careful not to run into the trap of disregarding the fishing sector. Our fishing fleet, as well as consisting of generations of family businesses, provide us with nutritious, low-carbon, high-protein food. Squeezing out the fishing industry from traditional fishing grounds for renewables harms island and coastal communities. We must ensure that there is greater awareness and understanding by the Scottish and UK governments and developers of the reality of spatial squeeze and the potential long-term consequences on this traditional industry and the impact on marine ecosystems. Just as there is objection to infrastructure on land, so there is at sea as well. There's no place to banish this infrastructure to either. Yes, I'll take an intervention.
Sarah Boyack.
For taking an intervention. I saw a briefing recently about the impact of sea-based turbines and the fact that it can actually benefit the fishing community in the long run in terms of seeing potential food for fish actually being created on the seabed. So isn't it a question of making sure that all the projects properly assess the opportunities and then actually deliver them when they're actually building those projects so that will benefit our nature and our fishing industries?
Here's just Wishart and give you the time back.
We need to see scientific evidence. We need to have robust evidence of that. But moving fishing vessels off the traditional grounds at the moment is causing considerable concern in my constituency. And so where infrastructure must exist, it should be built with consideration and communication with all stakeholders and communities. Shetland's home to the 4.5 megawatt Garth wind farm on the island of Yell, which to date has produced over 90,000 megawatts of energy. This £8.3 million investment is a community wind farm undertaken by the enterprising North Yell Development Council. The funds generated enable the organisation to invest in community projects, including the industrial estate extension and the development of the marina at Holyrood Pier, and they have enabled the employment of 3 full-time members of staff and funding to various local community groups. The wind farm is an asset which continues to bring benefits to the North Yell community and will do so for years to come. In my view, it's an exemplar of what can be achieved in the terms of practical community benefit. Shetland Heat Energy and Power, or SHEEP, has for the last 25 years delivered district heating to homes and public buildings like the hospital, schools and leisure centre in Lerwick. Based on the Danish model, customers have been spared soaring electricity costs in recent years, and its income from sales of around £1 million a year stays in Shetland. A project once dismissed as considered unusual, it's now being taken rather more seriously in policy circles. We know that our energy infrastructure is ageing. We know that we have to transition away from legacy fuels and reduce demand. We know that we need an energy mix for the foreseeable future. Shetland's ready to contribute on all fronts, from the development of renewables and continued oil and gas supply. I believe that those making national energy decisions fail to recognise the importance of gas from Rosebank, which would be exported through the West of Shetland pipeline system. This would pass through Sullomvo and end up in the UK grid, thereby reducing reliance on imported gas. That contribution to the UK's energy security should not be ignored. Generating power locally makes sense insofar as it reduces the inevitable loss of power between generation and destination. If communities are presented with manageable renewable projects as opposed to vast arrays that dominate the horizon, they are more likely to be in favour of the project, and especially on the basis that it will bring benefits for the community. The additional benefit of sustainable jobs in local places is a selling point to communities presented with such projects. As the energy sector transitions, we must support our workers, ensuring we don't once again see a repeat of decimated communities cast out of their jobs. There is, of course, much more that needs to be done in terms of housing and making it easier to access energy efficiency measures to upgrade properties with greater insulation and modern heating systems. Community benefit funds can help enable progress on this front. Increasing community-owned generation projects is a sensible path forward, and the Scottish Government should work to ensure that any barriers in the development of such projects are minimised and in the ability that they can support the supply chain and resource availability. Thank you, Presiding Officer.
Thank you, Ms Wishart. We now move to the open debate. I call first Christine Graham to be followed by Jamie Halker-Johnson. Around 6 minutes. Ms Graham.
Thank you very much, Deputy Presiding Officer. I'll admit, Cabinet Secretary, that this area, that is communities finding various routes to benefit from green energy projects such as turbines, solar panels, battery storage and hydro, quite confusing. But maybe that's just me, but I have a suspicion that the communities which could benefit will not be, as I have said, in deprived areas where folk could do with cheaper energy or funding for their area through the community benefit system. I would say that, with the exception of that community benefit from wind farm developments negotiated by communities with the developers, I also don't know of any communities which have utilised other routes. Again, I'll continue my investigation. Projects in my constituency, such as the community shop in Oxton and the redevelopment of the Crook Inn and associated buildings high in the hills at Tweedsmuir, are examples which come immediately to mind, which has come from community benefit funding. But then that has been going for some time now, and there are very skilled members of these communities. I am therefore pleased to read that under CARES, the Scottish Government is committed to updating good practice principles in negotiating community benefit. And I'd be interested in hearing from the Government what this updating will be and why, and if it will be simplified. Then there is the rare opportunity for a community having the... Yes, certainly.
Cabinet Secretary.
I can provide Christine Graham with some clarity. We've actually put out our good practice principles which were revised. They are actually out now. But as has been mentioned already in this debate, there was a legislative consent motion went to committee this morning, which was about mandating community engagement as well. But none of those are delivered by CARES. CARES is about supporting communities who want to have a community energy project. And given that Christine Graham has said she's not been able to find any examples in her constituency, I would advise that she have a look at the Local Energy Scotland, because there's actually dedicated staff for her area which may be able to advise her on what's already happening, but also she can put her constituents in touch if they want to support any new developments.
Christine Graham, I can give you the time back.
Thank you. Lesson learned, and thank you very much for that. Anyway, returning to the issue that I raised about that, there is the opportunity, though it's rare for a community having the option to buy shares in a wind farm development. But I think that's more of a wish list, because the capital required would be substantial. And I frankly, again, I'm going to get told off again. I don't know of any community in my constituency which has done this, bought shares in a private development. Though I note the Cabinet Secretary made reference to government support. Perhaps in summing up, this can be clarified. And I do have a question, maybe a daft question, but I'll ask it anyway. Would it be possible for a local authority, or in the case of the Scottish Government, to give planning authorities the flexibility to introduce either community benefit or share options, and I emphasise as a condition of planning consent? Because at the moment it's voluntary and negotiated. I don't know the answer to that. I think the Cabinet Secretary is about to rise and tell me the answer. Yes, I'll take the intervention.
Cabinet Secretary.
Christine Graham, again, we've, as a government, been calling on the mandating of community benefits. We did not have any luck with the previous UK government, but the current UK government have put out a consultation, which I think went out last week on this, and I'm looking forward to seeing the results of that.
Christine.
Yes, thank you very much. And I'm pleased to note that this is, of course, reserved, but that we are looking at something whereby there's sort of muscle in this now, and giving communities power to have this, and the local authorities to exercise their planning conditions. But meantime, I have to agree, some companies seem to be in more negotiating mode with communities. There is, for example, Longmuir Renewable Energy and Biodiversity Project in my constituency. This is Galileo Empower, which is developing proposals for a renewable energy and biodiversity project on land approximately 4.5 kilometres north of the village of Stow. It's only in the initial stages, but its proposals are for up to 10 turbines, co-location of solar photovoltaics and a battery energy storage system. But what the developer also proposes is a renewable electricity discount scheme, known as REDS, which will be cheaper electricity generated by this project and distributed to locally designated areas. And in addition, not as an option, but in addition, a 10% community ownership stake. This is early days, and I'm unclear, for example, in this particular instance, if that 10% has to be bought by the community and purchased, or just part of the contract. Which brings me to CARES, the Community Energy Renewable Schemes, and I note that since its inception, it has advised over 1,300 organisations and provided 67 million in funding to communities throughout Scotland. But now that it's reopening again, and that various communities can bid for support from an £8 million government fund, it closes in September, and it is capped I recommend to my constituent communities they don't waste time and apply PDQ. That fund could help them to install wind turbines and solar panels or develop other types of renewable energy generation, such as hydro, which would meet what they need locally. And I end on the wider benefits of community ownership, such as, I think Patrick Harvey referenced this. It's 34 times more local economic return from a community-owned wind turbine than a privately owned one. It's much better even than the current community benefit arrangement. It'd get higher public support, of course it will have. 62% of people back community-owned energy projects in their area. And I conclude on this quote from a Social Enterprise Scotland report. Quote, in terms of sheer size, the benefit payments from community-owned wind farms far exceed the payments from private wind farms. And I do hope today's debate opens up the opportunities for communities in my constituency, and I'll certainly be publicising it. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms Graham. I now call Jamie Halker-Johnson to be followed by Michael Mathis in around 6 minutes. Mr Halker-Johnson.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. I'm pleased to be able to speak in this debate today on a subject which is, of course, of great importance to my Highlands and Islands region, and I do recognise, as others have done, the benefit of community-owned energy and those projects right across the region, and particularly where they help increase and support local resilience, which is obviously such an important issue as well. However, I'd like to focus on the Scottish Conservative amendment and the challenges communities across my region face from energy infrastructure. There is a growing frustration, a growing anger from those living and running businesses across the Highlands and Islands who feel under siege from large-scale energy projects being forced on our communities. For years, many have been subjected to wind farms they see little or no benefit from, as power flows past their homes, but their bills keep on rising. In Shetland, fuel poverty is an ever-present issue for many households, despite the islands hosting hundreds of megawatts of onshore wind. Viking, as Beatrice Wishart mentioned, was supposed to power around 500,000 homes, although, as she rightly says, some of those concerns over those figures have not been met. But they don't keep bills in Shetland down. New onshore wind farms continue to be given the green light, and existing sites continue to grow despite millions of pounds of taxpayers' money being spent every year on constraint payments. In 2024, those payments rose to £380 million. That isn't money going into local communities, but often into the coffers of multinational companies, and in many cases national governments like China, the United Arab Emirates, France and Ireland. Yes.
Minister. I thank the member for giving way, and I absolutely accept the importance of the issue that he raises about constraint payments. I say this just as a matter of fact. I'm sure he'll agree with. Does he agree that the authorities at a UK level need to be involved in the debate that he's just raised? These are all reserved issues.
Jamie Halker-Johnson.
Thank you. A lot of these issues are actually around planning, and they are responsibility of this government. And the Scottish Government can't keep washing its hands of every issue. This is something that your government, this is an issue that the Minister's government has an area of responsibility to, and I'll come a little bit to that later. But of course, it's not just the turbines, it's the pylons, the transformers, the huge battery storage sites, as others have mentioned. Communities are having invasive industrialisation forced upon them. A week or so ago, I met with residents impacted by proposals for a substation at Fenelon. Some want to sell their homes, but are being told interest in their property is being reduced because of the proposals. Others want to stay. They want to fight the proposals, to which some are concerned are being cited in the wrong place. But as I raised with the SNP government in a question only last week, those residents and others across the country simply don't have the money, the resource or the expertise to contest these plans. They're up against massive companies with huge financial and legal resources. So how do they compete with that? I asked the Minister exactly that question. What support does the Scottish Government provide to local communities to access legal and regulatory advice? Or do they just expect local people to foot the bill to protect their homes and their local communities? His response was just to deflect. So I guess that answers the question for these communities. You have to protect your own communities, because the SNP government certainly isn't going to. The same issues are faced by communities across the Highlands and Islands. At Glenelg, plans for new power lines take a new route threaten one of Scotland's most iconic views, one enjoyed by thousands of people every year as they take the Glenelg ferry to Skye. But it's not just the infrastructure itself, but those undertaking it. 2 large accommodation camps are planned around Broadford on Skye, bringing hundreds of workers into small communities which local residents fear don't have the facilities and amenities to cope with them. The very nature of the community risks being impacted and impacted for many years. At my recent surgery in Dalwhinnie, those impacted by the Urba Pump Hydro project highlighted their concerns. These were common with so many across the region. What will the impact on those living near the project be? How will local roads, sometimes single-track only, cope with increased volumes of traffic? How will this work be coordinated with other major problems, such as the dualling of the A9, if that happens, to avoid the perfect storm of disruption? And most frustratingly and most commonly, why can't local communities be kept better informed by developers and by government? Presiding Officer, for many of these communities I've spoken of today, this is not just an issue about planning, but about democracy and power. Many of us in the Highlands and Islands support renewable energy in principle. What we oppose is the current model that puts corporate interest and national targets over community voices. To hit their targets, the SNP is pushing a top-down energy policy which is leaving residents and local communities feeling ignored, sidelined and sacrificed. Where there is a serious democratic deficit with planning decisions often overriding local objections. Where local communities feel local consultations and engagement are tokenistic at best. And where too many residents only learn of new projects when the approval process is already well advanced. And anger is so great because there is a feeling that the unprecedented concentration of proposed energy developments would never be tolerated in the Central Belt. That our communities are being exploited in a way that government politicians would never allow in their own areas. That it's our communities and our homes that are threatened by a wave of Central Belt environmental imperialism. And I would remind everyone of what the Scottish Conservatives are calling for today in our amendment. That community consent needs to be at the heart of energy production. That pylons and other energy and electricity infrastructure are increasingly being built without the support of residents. That the Scottish Government give communities more say over local energy production. There is nothing in the Scottish Conservative amendment that any MSP who's truly representing the wishes of their constituents should oppose. They should support that amendment today or answer to our constituents if they don't.
Thank you. I now call Michael Matheson to be followed by Alec Rowley. Around 6 minutes. Mr Matheson.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. Like a number of those who have made contributions so far, I've witnessed first-hand the benefits of the CARE scheme within my own constituency, and also when I was the Energy Secretary and seeing first-hand the installation of Archimedes screws and wind turbines and solar panel facilities. But I think one of the things that I've noticed over recent years that communities have benefited from the CARES programme in particular has been helpful are projects which have benefited from CARES renewable projects where they have taken on a community asset which has been managed within the local community, particularly to help to generate their own energy and also to make them much more energy efficient. And I think the scheme has got a lot to be commended to it. And I also welcome the fact that the UK Government are now moving down a route where they are looking to support community energy programmes much more extensively in England and Wales. So I think the CARES programme is a very good one, and one which I think we should continue to develop and progress. I think it is also worth reflecting on some of the challenges that there are with the CARES programme. In my own constituency experience, some of the challenges relate to a lack of knowledge about what's available and the ability to actually develop a project. And to have the knowledge and understanding on how to go about doing that. And actually some of the community assets that have been transferred are in communities where to some degree capacity is lacking in being able to take on something much more complex around energy renewables. And one of the things that then brings me on to is the issue about community capacity to take forward some of these projects in themselves, because we can see first-hand the benefit that communities get from them, but some of those communities that would benefit from them the most are the ones who are struggling to have the capacity to be able to take forward what can be a fairly complex project. And I know that Local Energy Scotland do a tremendous amount of work in working with communities and community groups, but what can be a complex issue, not just from a technical perspective, but very often from a funding perspective, because there will be multi-party funding in these projects, very often through CARES, through it may be Scottish Power's community programme, it may be other philanthropic organisations that are making contributions to it, and aligning these can at times be challenging. I want to, though, just reflect on some of the wider issues, I think, around community energy and the ability to expand and develop shared ownership in energy assets as well, because we are at a crucial time in our energy transition, and we are at a point where we have an abundant amount of renewable potential. We have a significant pipeline of renewable energy projects in development or being progressed. While we can see the value of these renewable projects, the renewable industry faces challenges and questions from communities and from the public about what benefit they get from some of these assets. And that's understandable, because we're in an environment where we have some of the communities that experience the greatest levels of fuel poverty are the ones where we see these assets being built out, not only in terms of wind turbines, but also in terms of the transmission network, where they're impacted as well. And I do think there is a genuine issue where communities do feel as too often things are being done to them rather than with them in this transition in our energy sector. And I think there is much more that we need to do in order to try to address some of these concerns and to address some of the challenges that these communities are facing. And one of the aspects I believe that can assist us in achieving that is through greater community ownership, but not necessarily in whole ownership. It may be shared ownership with some of these significant assets that are being built. And I think we should need to look at that, not just through the lens of whether it be just a small wind farm that is onshore, but it's also about offshore assets and also significant assets like hydro pump storage. How do we ensure that communities have a genuine ownership of that asset alongside those who are the commercial developers of it? And I think if we can achieve that much more effectively, embedding the principles of community wealth building and how we take that forward with these assets, then I believe, and I think the evidence shows very often, is that communities are much more willing to see the benefits they can get from these assets by helping to bring money into the local area and helping to, in some cases through, and there are schemes that I'm happy to share with Christine Graham, where they've been able to reduce energy costs for the local community as well as a result of having shared ownership of that. So I think this is an aspect that can help us to overcome some of those challenges. I do know, just like some others have mentioned, the progress that has been made in some other countries. For example, in Denmark, and the Community Energy Scotland briefing shows very starkly the way in which they've been able to ensure that community ownership of wind assets has been embedded there since 2008, where they are now at 52% of their wind assets are community owned, which is less than 0.5% here in Scotland. So although we've been making progress, I think there is much more we could do. And I think the industry also recognise that this is helpful to communities if they feel that they are partners in owning some of this. And the final point I would make, Deputy Presiding Officer, is the way in which we can use Scottish Government-owned facilities and assets. The land that's owned by Forestry Land Scotland, the land that is owned by Scottish Water, how can we utilise that to help to support local communities as well, to support them in looking at community energy-based projects? Collectively, I think we are doing well, but we can do better. And I've got no doubt that the Scottish Government and the Cabinet Secretary will be determined to make sure we drive that forward in the process of widening out the way in which the CARES programme is operating.
Thank you. I now call Alec Rowley to be followed by Jackie Dunbar. Around 6 minutes, Mr Rowley.
Thank you. Presiding Officers, Community Energy Scotland and the Scottish Community Coalition on Energy have provided a brief for this debate today, and I think the points they make are well worth putting on the record. They say we have an abundant renewables potential and considerable capacity in the pipeline. However, the industry is facing challenges, including securing sufficient investment and public support. At the same time, energy bills and fuel poverty levels are still far too high, and many people feel powerless when it comes to the energy transition. We recognise that many communities feel that it's been done to them, not with them or for them. Community ownership of energy addresses all of these challenges. It puts communities in control, enabling them to make choices about location and design of developments that suit their own needs. It provides greater financial benefit for local economies. Community-owned turbines provide 34 times more funding per megawatt to the local community than privately owned turbines. Community and shared ownership increases public support for renewables. 62% of the public would support community-owned energy in their area. This should translate into improved investor confidence and support project delivery. Without increased community and shared ownership, Scotland's net zero targets may be at risk. But if we can grow community ownership, we can increase support for clear energy while powering true community wealth building. We can ensure a just energy transition for Scotland's communities. Community Energy Scotland and the Scottish Community Coalition on emergencies on energy argue the Scottish Government can support the growth of community energy in Scotland by 1. Setting up a statutory target for community energy. They recommend 1 gigawatt of wholly community-owned energy by 2030. This should be distinct from the 2 gigawatt target for local and community-owned energy. We should ensure that Scotland plays its part in meeting the UK target of 8 gigawatts of community energy by 2030. This will allow us to leverage in more UK government funding, and it is crucial that both governments work together. 2. Making space for community energy on public land. Forestry and Land Scotland alone hosts over 1 gigawatt of wind capacity on its land, all in private ownership. As others have said, there is significant opportunity for a portion of this to transfer into community ownership when the current leases expire. The recent test case at the Crookmore on the Cowal Peninsula was a missed opportunity for full community ownership. Scottish Government should issue guidance to land-owning public bodies that they should give local community bodies the opportunity to acquire new or repowering lease before putting them out to tender on the open market. They explain that repowering is when the technology needs upgraded before continuing to operate. 3. Setting an industry-wide good practice benchmark for shared ownership offers. They recommend 20% as a minimum stake offered to local communities. This would bring Scotland in line with Denmark, where, as others have pointed out, a policy of 20% minimum shared ownership since 2008 has led to around 52% of wind in Denmark being citizen-owned, compared to just 0.2% in Scotland, and has allowed the country to move faster in decarbonising its energy mix. The Scottish Government could set a voluntary benchmark by updating its good practice principles for shared ownership, and renewable projects on the public land could be required to meet this benchmark. 4. Enabling local authorities to buy energy direct from community energy groups. This would mean lower costs for the local authority and a guaranteed income for the community group, retaining wealth in the community. The next revision of the National Framework Agreement for the supply of electricity should enable local authorities who use the framework to buy a percentage of their power from local communities. And finally, 5, provide multi-year funding for community energy and heat projects. The recent increase in Scottish Government funding for community energy is very welcome and will allow more communities to access additional private finance. However, projects are being held back by short funding timescales. Longer timescales to utilise the funding, which enable the majority of construction work to happen out with the winter months, would unlock more growth in the sector, and there is also a need for support programmes for communities-led development and ownership of heat networks to meet the growing community interest in the area. So it would be good, I hope, that the Scottish Government will look at those 5 proposals and they will give serious consideration to the points that are being made. That I'll conclude, Presiding Officer.
Thank you very much, Mr Rowley. I now call Jackie Dunbar to be followed by Audrey Nicholl again, around 6 minutes. Mr Dunbar.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I'm delighted to be able to take part in today's debate, growing community-owned energy in Scotland, and getting the chance once more to talk up Aberdeen. With energy in the title of today's debate, let me start, as I do every time that happens, by reminding folk that Aberdeen, which I represent part of, is the energy capital of Europe and the future net zero capital of the world. And more relevant to today's debate, is home to Scotland's first urban community hydro energy project, the very well named Donside Hydro. The Donside Hydro is owned by Aberdeen Community Energy, which was set up by the Donside Community Association with the aim to help make Donside Village a sustainable community. At this point, Presiding Officer, as the MSP for Aberdeen Donside, I feel it's important to note that Donside Hydro, the Donside Community Association and Donside Village are all in the constituency of Aberdeen Central, and it's really not confusing at all. But the Donside Hydro doesn't just have a fantastic name. It won the Scottish Green Energy Award in 2016 and is Aberdeen's first community energy scheme. Unfortunately, it is also currently our city's only community generation project, and that needs to change. Scotland is an energy-rich country, and Aberdeen has been at the heart of it for half a century. But far too few folk are getting the benefits from that energy. We've seen 50 years and billions of pounds of oil and gas revenues make their way to Westminster and to private shareholders. In the energy capital of Europe, far too many of my constituents are living in fuel poverty. Far too many are struggling to pay their energy bills, and far too many are scared to put on the heating when it gets cold outside. The move to net zero will give us a chance to do some things differently. It isn't just about how the energy is harnessed, but how the benefits of doing it are shared, and shared in a way that benefits all and not just the few. I've seen enough how community energy projects can work in the North East to know that we need to be doing more. In Donside, that's the bit in Aberdeen Central, with the Archimedes screw, we have a scheme that generates clean, renewable energy for homes and businesses. A scheme that shows how renewable energy is generated and supports education around that. A scheme that produces a fund that supports local community initiatives. Elsewhere in the North East, within Alexander Burnett's constituency of Aberdeenshire West, I know that Huntly have done similar, but with a wind turbine rather than a hydro project. And I know they've used their proceeds along with match funding in a very impressive way. Both are great examples of Scotland's natural resources benefiting local communities. With the vast renewable resource we have, I want to see more benefit from that. For communities, for consumers, for the wider economy, and hopefully at some point soon for my constituents. Before I start to comment on some of the amendments today, I feel it's important to recognise that every single amendment is an addendum and that there is a lot of common ground in this chamber when it comes to community energy. Now to focus on some of the ground that isn't in common. Douglas Lumsden has previously made no secret of his position on pylons. But here's the thing, If you were to say not that long ago that Scotland would be able to export its wind and sell it to England, you would have gotten some very strange looks. We now have that opportunity. We just need to install the infrastructure. I fully accept that this infrastructure should support lower bills. People should see a more tangible link between pylons going up and their electric bills coming down. But unfortunately, a lot of that comes down to the UK Government and to GB Energy. And that brings me on to the Labour amendment. I'll never say no to money being made available to communities in Scotland, but with billions being taken out of Scotland's energy industry by the windfall tax, I'm sure the UK Government could afford to loosen the purse strings just a wee bit more. Unfortunately, none of the technology we've discussed today can harness energy from hot air, so I will draw my remarks to a close, Presiding Officer. We know the future of energy is renewables, and community ownership puts renewable energy generation into the hands of the folk and communities across Scotland. The idea of Scotland's future being in Scotland's hands is something I will always support and fight for, and I look forward to seeing more locally generated power benefiting communities across Scotland in years to come. Thank you.
Thank you. I now call Audrey Nicholl to be followed by Finlay Carson. Around 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. And despite energy featuring so heavily in the Chamber week in, week out, I've learned a lot while preparing for today's debate. It's been really helpful to understand a bit more about the community energy landscape, the opportunities created by the Scotland's Community Energy Growth Fund, and also to understand the challenges faced and how we can respond in general terms with regard to developing community energy opportunities. So, as well as generating renewable energy as large-scale projects, as we've already heard, it makes sense to have smaller-scale projects bringing together households and businesses, or both, to create community energy schemes. And as you would expect in Scotland, there are many wind and hydro projects in rural areas, making the most of our natural resources to reach our interim target of 2 gigawatts of renewable energy capacity in local ownership by 2030. Wind turbine projects seem to be the most common option, if sometimes a bit controversial. Hydro schemes seem viable but limited due to requiring communities to be located near a watercourse, and of course there are many other options, including district heat networks, as we've heard. Now, Aberdeen City hosts several district heat networks, including in my constituency, that supply low-cost energy to homes, public buildings and businesses. And with strong political leadership, funding and policy clarity, heat networks certainly do offer opportunities to maximise the benefit of heat decarbonisation. But one business in my constituency produces significant heat as a byproduct of its process to produce fish meal that could contribute to the local district heat network scheme. However, to date, that has proved unsuccessful. So I welcome the Scottish Government's new £8 million Community Energy Regeneration Growth Fund that will support local communities install wind turbines and solar panels, or develop other types of renewable energy generation, such as hydro, to heat and power local homes and businesses. And significant progress has already been made thanks to the work of CARES, which we've heard about, which has provided over £67 million in funding to more than 990 community projects. And I did enjoy listening to Michael Matheson outlining some of the benefits that CARES has already delivered in his constituency and beyond. So I'm grateful to everyone who assisted me think about some of the points that are worth exploring further in terms of some of the challenges going forward, but I don't think are insurmountable. So first, on definition, the community ownership in Scotland user Guide of 2024 defines a community on a geographical basis. However, the problem for developers may be the potential for leaving someone out. There will always be that line on a map or a community on the wrong side of that line. Are community groups the right target for community ownership, as we've already heard? Not every community has perhaps the experience, the expertise or desire to engage in these opportunities. So how do we enable communities to consider a community energy project in the first place? Which models work well, are outcomes driven and can be delivered genuinely by communities? Will they be able to raise the capital to invest or buy up to, say, 10% of a project? Is there flexibility to make investment more attractive by offering, say, a 5% investment? And others have highlighted the potential role of local authorities in supporting community energy projects, whether through the provision of land, investing in projects, if indeed they are permitted to do so. I will.
I thank the member for taking intervention. I think the point is that we have loads and loads of that experience. What we need to do is package it up and share it with communities so that they can take the choice that's going to work for their community, regardless of its size and where it is in Scotland.
Audrey Nicholl, and give you the time back.
Thank you. And I thank Sarah Boyack for that intervention. I 100% agree. I think there's maybe a specific piece of work to look at how we do that, and I'd be happy to be part of that. So could communities invest in projects out with their geographic area, which we've already heard about as well? Not all communities are created equal when it comes to their ability to create energy. So is there scope to develop a system of sharing the funds generated by our renewable energy? That said, local communities may feel that that's our project. We're the ones impacted by it. However, by restricting it, this could cut off communities that might arguably benefit more from additional investment and revenue. How might investors respond when presented with a project that includes an obligation to sell on a percentage to a community partner? I think many investors would welcome this opportunity. However, how would that sit with their obligations? And I think this point links again with the distinction that was well made by Patrick Harvey between community ownership and community benefit. What sources of investment would community projects require over and above funding? And I note the UK Government's recent call for evidence on community energy projects cited funding as the biggest barrier. So the Scottish Government funding announcement is really welcome. So I note the commitment by GB Energy to provide over £20 million over the next financial year to support community projects, and I do hope that we see tangible benefit within that coming to Scotland. And there is no doubt community energy projects have the potential to leave a lasting legacy, and developers, governments and the public want to be part of that legacy. So to conclude, I commend the work of Community Energy Scotland, Scottish Government and so many other organisations and stakeholders working in this space. And I do think that it is really important that communities understand the likely parameters and economic realities for community investment or shared ownership schemes, helping strengthen social contact with renewables that is truly just, fair and lasting. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms Nicholl. I now call Finlay Carson to be followed by Emma Harper. Around 6 minutes. Mr Carson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Like many colleagues here today, I support the principle behind this motion, expanding community-owned energy in Scotland. But principles must be matched by practice. And this is where I'm going to rain on the Cabinet Secretary's parade, because in Dumfries and Galloway, that's simply not happening. The Scottish Conservative Amendment rightly states that community consent needs to be at the heart of energy production. Yet in my region, I don't believe that principle has ever been taken seriously, and it's still being routinely ignored. In just the last 3 years, 30 wind farm, pylon and battery storage schemes have been approved in Dumfries and Galloway by the Energy Consent Unit. Many of the wind turbines are over 150 metres, some exceeding 200 metres in height. These are not small-scale community-led projects. They are industrial-scale developments, often driven by external developers with little local accountability. Meanwhile, our planning system is overwhelmed. Dumfries and Galloway Council's planning department is under immense pressure with delays and backlogs that prevent proper scrutiny. Applications must be assessed strictly in order of receipt, regardless of scale or urgency, an approach that benefits developers, not communities. Worse still, Section 36 applications for developments over 50... Certainly will.
Craig Hoy.
I thank Finlay Carson for giving way. Does he share my concern amongst communities, particularly in the South West, but right across the whole of the south of Scotland, such as those who are affected by the Scoop Hill development outside Moffat, that developers come back time and time again with applications, variations of the same theme? So they only have to win once, whereas the community have to stand up repeatedly to these developments.
Finlay Carson, I'll give you time back.
Thanks for that intervention. I absolutely agree. And it's absolutely exhausting for some people who live right in the footprints of these wind farms. They win one battle and then another challenge comes along. In that vein, Section 36 applications for developments over 50 megawatts bypass local decision-making entirely. Councils can only object or not object. If they don't object, the Scottish Government can approve the project without a public inquiry. This process sidelines local voices and centralises power in Edinburgh. Public opposition is widespread. Community councils and residents have submitted hundreds of objections, citing landscape degradation, wildlife disruption and a cumulative visual impact. Yet these concerns are too often dismissed without explanation. Even well-organised campaigns like Save Our Hills and Galloway Without Pylons are struggling to be heard. And they're right now fighting a totally inappropriate application for wind farms right on top of one of the region's jewels, a historic area of outstanding natural beauty. That is Glen Trool. Yes, I'll give way to Audrey Nicholl.
Audrey Nicholl.
The member for giving way. I think just to point out, it does seem to get missed in chamber quite a bit, regardless of what side of the debate you're on, particularly with regard to pylons and the grid expansion. But just to point out the number of stakeholders that have a say and control, if you like, the whole system with regard to consenting and the expansion of the grid. It's not just the Scottish Government.
Finlay Carson, I'll give you the time back.
I appreciate that, but right now these applications are being dealt with by the Energy Consent Unit in the Scottish Government, and more often than not, local opinions are being ignored. 50 communities across the region have called for a moratorium on new wind farm consents. They point to data from Nature Scot showing that southern Scotland has more proposed onshore wind developments than any other part of the country. According to the Scottish Government's own figures, South West Scotland hosts 21% of all the onshore wind turbines in Scotland, a disproportionate burden by any measure. Studies show the impact on property values and tourism are very negative. And yet in March, the Energy Minister insisted that the Government should focus on renewables without offering any clarity on how much industrialisation is too much for rural Scotland. We already have overcapacity in Galloway. There is no clear plans for when or where it will stop. That's why earlier this year I called... Yep, I'll give way.
Douglas Lumsden.
The member for taking an intervention, and I was listening to what he was saying about community groups. And does he share my concern that no Scottish minister seemed to meet with community groups who are opposed to much of this overdevelopment, but they're quite happy to meet companies like SSEN or SPEN?
Finlay Carson.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a real concern. And I know the excuse we get is that they can't get involved in individual planning. But right now I could be quite happy to invite the Minister down to Galloway to speak to these groups, not on a specific planning application, but the widespread proliferation of wind farms right across the region and the detriment to local communities. That's why I called for a moratorium on further renewable applications in my constituency. But sadly, I'm not going to hold my breath. Since May 2022, the Energy Consent Unit has approved over 235 major energy infrastructure projects, including wind farms, pylons and battery storage. Only 8 were rejected. The Scottish Government points to schemes like CARES and the new £8 million Community Energy Generation Growth Fund, but these initiatives are not reaching the communities that we know will be most affected by large-scale developments. In Dumfries and Galloway, true community ownership remains the exception, not the norm. If the Government is serious about community energy, it must reform the planning system to give local voices real power. It must stop treating regions like Dumfries and Galloway as energy sacrifice zones, and it must redistribute funding to genuinely community-led projects, not developer-driven schemes with tokenistic benefit funds. Finally, Presiding Officer, the Scottish Government must stop paying lip service to my constituents. Ministers recently approved a massive pylon route through some of the most beautiful landscapes in Scotland, ignoring both local objections and the reporter's recommendations following a public inquiry that cost the taxpayer nearly £200,000. That decision was a blatant disregard for local democracy. If we want a just transition, it must be one that listens to and respects the communities that are most affected. Thank you.
Thank you. And I call Emma Harper to be followed by Colin Smith. Around 6 minutes. Ms Harper.
Presiding Officer, first of all, please accept my apologies. I wasn't here at the beginning of this debate. Firstly, I can't help but make at least a passing mention of the history of Norway's community-owned energy sector, in their case the entire oil and gas sectors, as well as a hefty chunk of hydro. The Norwegians took a groundbreaking decision decades ago to ensure that their government, on behalf of the people, would have strategic ownership of oil and gas developments from the 1980s onwards. The result is today a Norwegian sovereign wealth fund worth over £1.7 trillion, and the biggest debates in their parliament are how much can be spent without overinflating the economy. At the same time, the UK government was using North Sea revenues to subsidise tax cuts and the destruction of huge swathes of our industrial base. Not for nothing was the unemployment benefit known in the 1980s as oil money. Clearly, the days of drilling for hydrocarbons with no regard for the wider environmental implications are gone, but Norway shows what real community ownership on a national scale looks like, rather than frittered away by a parliament far, far away. We can take the success of Norway, but decentralise it and put communities in charge of their own energy destiny and work with them to ensure the benefits of the green industrial revolution that lies with them rather than being expropriated elsewhere. There are a number of wind farms in the south at various stages of the planning process, and I think it is fair to say none of them enjoy universal popular support, as we've just heard, but all of them enjoy some public support. There are obviously different objections for each development, and there are many examples, such as the Sandy Now wind farm at Sankar in my region, who have they've developed a good record of community engagement and action and work together with local residents as a matter of normal business. But I believe that the common thread throughout all the proposals currently on the table in the south is the lack of community involvement and community ownership. Some feel Just 1 second, Mr Carson. Some feel that they are being frozen out of the benefits and the management of renewables, while expected to actually basically thole the presence of all these wind turbines. And that was reflected by Michael Matheson when he stated that communities feel that they are being done to and not done with. And I will take an intervention.
Finlay Carson.
I thank the member for taking my intervention. It's a very simple yes-no question. Does Emma Harper think there's too many wind farms in Dumfries and Galloway?
Emma Harper.
Personally, I can see where the argument is that people will say that that there are too many wind farms in Dumfries and Galloway, but I also think that we need to reflect on where we are in terms of achieving net zero, developing a renewable sector, getting the communities to benefit from all that. So I don't think it is just an easy yes-no answer when we're looking at how we support our communities and the environment and tackle biodiversity, the nature crisis, climate crisis and all that. That's a whole another debate. Some in this chamber will be aware of the goat culling west of Newcastleton, which has caused outrage locally as the new owners of the estate tried to clear the majority of a goat population that has been there for over a millennium. Oxygen Conservation purchased the Blackburn and Harsgarth estate 2 years ago and have made a big play of their plans for rewilding across the 11,000 acres. But in the middle of their rewilding pitch to the community is buried a reference to building the UK's biggest onshore wind farm. And when I raised their intentions for the estate with them, Oxygen revised their estimate and said that there would be a wind farm, not just the UK's biggest. Now, I don't necessarily have an objection to marrying up rewilding and large-scale native tree planting with a renewable scheme, but it is clear from all the Langham locals who have been campaigning against the goat culling actions of the owners that they haven't been engaged with properly about the prospect of another wind farm being erected in their backyard. Now, I don't envy the planning authorities or the Scottish Government in making the decisions about wind farms or the infrastructure that supports them. I'm proud we have a government that takes the transition to net zero seriously and has put in place a framework to make that happen. Getting the balance between, getting the balance between the national and international focus versus the very real concerns of local communities is at times a thankless task. That's why I think community ownership of wind power across all renewables has to be a top priority. I don't want people to feel that they've lost control of their land and their economic future, their sustainable development future from corporations who are basically coming from other places, greenwashing and providing less than a possibly available community benefit fund while extracting the maximum profit possible. Community ownership means the full involvement of the entire community from the beginning of the process, from conception to planning to development. It means the full financial benefit of renewables development flowing to local communities rather than a small portion of the income. Dumfries and Galloway has 47 community or locally owned projects funded under the Community and Renewable Energy Scheme CARES, not just wind farms but harnessing the potential technology of anaerobic digestion and biogas from the agricultural sector, given the potential to hook up households off the gas grid or to create district heating systems of the future. I am interested in anaerobic digestion and how we can pursue that to support our dairy farmers across our South Scotland region as well. So I hope the £8 million fund established by the Government will grow and grow over the years, empowering communities across the South and the whole of Scotland and building a future that ensures our communities and the people of Scotland have a direct stake and get a direct benefit from the net zero society we are bringing to fruition. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms Harper. I now call Colin Smith to be followed by Fergus Ewing. Around 6 minutes. Mr Smith.
Presiding Officer, at a time when people feel more disconnected than ever from those whose decisions shape their lives and too many people believe that power sits too far from those it affects, it's timely to debate that imbalance of power that exists in the energy sector. Too often communities feel that the drive to net zero, the growth in renewable energy is something done to them, not for them, and certainly not with them. It's a sector in Scotland dominated by large foreign-owned multinationals, many publicly owned, just not by us. A sector where it's not just the wind farms that are increasingly offshored, but the supply chain jobs and the profits too. By 2019, my home region of Dumfries and Galloway, with 2% of Scotland's population, hosted 11% of Scotland's onshore wind turbines. But we didn't get 11% of the jobs, and not a single one of those turbines was built in the region or indeed anywhere in Scotland. At the same time, the region has some of the highest levels of fuel poverty in the country, with many of those cold, damp homes sitting next door to the very wind farms that are exporting electricity far from the communities that host them. That disconnect is fuelling the worrying growing resentment towards net zero policies and being exploited by those who want to scrap climate action altogether. Presiding Officer, we won't meet our climate targets unless we do far more to take communities with us. And one of the best ways to do that is to give people a real stake in their energy future, real community ownership over decisions, over infrastructure, over the benefits. Community-owned energy is about more than clean power. It's about changing the relationship between people and the decisions that shape their lives. It's about moving communities from being bystanders to being active partners and owners, and it's about building an energy system that works for people, not just corporate profit. That means challenging the idea that the most a community can hope for is a benefit payment decided by someone else. Now, I appreciate these community benefit payments are not insignificant. The South of Scotland Enterprise Agency has estimated that over the next 35 years, community benefit funding from onshore wind in the south could total nearly £900 million. At a time public sector budgets are squeezed, those payments make a difference to communities. But how that funding is implemented often reinforces the imbalance of power. Developers decide the amount, developers decide the conditions, and funding often arrives too late for communities to plan strategically. The result, money is spent, but it is not always well spent. That's why I very much welcome the UK Government's recent proposals to reform community benefit arrangements, making them mandatory with clearer standards, earlier engagement and greater transparency over how benefits are calculated and delivered. I hope the Scottish Government will work with the UK Government to ensure those changes are implemented effectively here in Scotland. But if we want to go beyond damage control, I'm happy to do that, yeah.
Cabinet Secretary.
I'm glad that the members mentioned the actions that have been taken to mandate community benefit. But you recognise that the Scottish Government had been calling the previous government to do this for many years, but with no action.
Colin Smith.
I very much recognise that, and it's good to see that the change of government at UK level with a Labour government has made that difference already. But if we want to go beyond just damage control and we want to genuinely reset the relationship, we need to give communities meaningful ownership. Scotland has failed to develop the kind of mixed economy and energy we see elsewhere in Europe. In Denmark, over 50% of onshore wind farms are owned by communities, co-ops or councils. In Scotland, it's barely 1%. It's not enough to encourage community ownership, it needs to be delivered. The Cooperative Party Scotland's Green Energy Future strategy sets out how to do that by putting communities, not corporations, at the very heart of energy transition. The proposals, many echoed by Community Energy Scotland, offer a practical and ambitious roadmap, not just supporting the doubling of funding for CARES, but proposing the creation of a ring-fence fund within the Scottish National Investment Bank for large-scale community projects. It also calls for reform of the Scottish Government's energy procurement strategy to give community generators a route to the market, and crucially calls for investment in early-stage capacity, training and support so communities have the ability and capacity to take advantage of ownership opportunities. The Cooperative Party also called for fast-tracking and the waiving of planning fees for community schemes, enabling pension fund investment and strengthening shared ownership in offshore wind. Crucially, they propose scaling up retrofit cooperatives to help tackle fuel poverty directly. Public land and buildings also need to be made more available to community energy groups to unlock new opportunities and remove unnecessary barriers. And as we've heard, land reform must guarantee communities the right to access land when it becomes available, especially for local renewables. And we need to empower councils and public bodies to lead or partner on projects, whether that's electricity generation or community-led heat networks. Together, these measures wouldn't just grow community energy, they begin to rebalance the power in our energy system so that the rewards of renewables stay in the communities that host them. Presiding Officer, as a Cooperative MSP, in my forward to that Cooperative Party Scotland's Green Energy Future paper, I said we shouldn't view our net zero targets as a barrier to sustainable economic growth. They are the path to it, but the fruits of that labour must be fairly shared. That's the challenge in front of us. Positive action is already underway through Great British Energy, which has committed £4 million to help launch the Community Energy Generation Growth Fund, and it's a clear example of what public ownership can do to support communities. The race for green jobs of the future is underway. Scotland can lead, but only if we stop repeating the mistakes of the past. That means building an energy future that's not just clean, but more democratic, more locally owned and fairer. A future where local people have a real say in how energy is produced and where the benefits stay in the community. Presiding Officer, we will only deliver a just transition if that transition is community-led.
Thank you, Mr Smith. We now come to the final speaker in the open debate, Fergus Ewing, a generous 6 minutes. Mr Ewing.
May I also apologise for being slightly late. I should, of course, Presiding Officer, have emulated my late mother, Winnie, who more often than not turned up at least an hour before any engagement was due to begin, often public meetings where the doorkeeper was actually in the process of unlocking the door to the hall. So there's very few doorkeepers in community halls throughout the Highlands and Islands who, as a result, were not canvassed by Winnie Ewing. Let me begin by referring to a learned article by the distinguished historian and energy analyst, the Pulitzer Prize-winning Daniel Yergin, one of the world's experts, I think, on energy. And he made the point in a Times article recently that it took 2 centuries for coal to replace wood as the main source of heating. And then it took 1 century for oil and gas to replace coal. So the point he was making was that transitions take time, and they very often take longer than politicians would wish. And there is a tendency, I think, to set targets which very often are unrealistic and unachievable. And I won't go through the examples in this session of Parliament, because it would use up the rest of my speech. But it was Chris Stark who actually said, Chris used to work for me when I was the Energy Minister, but he said that undeliverable targets get in the way of genuine action. And I think there is a risk of that. Now, in this debate, there have been many interesting contributions from all sides, from all parties, I believe, and I think there is an agreement that community projects, community ownership is very desirable, and I'm not going to repeat what has been said. That would be a waste of debating time, other than to say that the point has been made by many, I think Christine Graham and others, that community ownership has been found to be 34 times of greater financial value than community benefit paid at the standard rate of 5k per megawatt. The source of that information, I should say, I think is an Aquaterra report to the Point and Sandwich Development Trust in 21, which I have here, so just to give credit where it's due. But that's undoubtedly true, and therefore the fund announced by the Minister today is welcome, and it will, the case studies show small projects in Dundee, Drimmen, or near Drimmen, and Glasgow. They're welcome. But I think members want to go much, much further than that. And I agree with that, and I agree with the suggestions that have been made about involvement of local authorities, of others. I do think that private companies should be partners, not enemies, though. That's essential for the success. And when I was Energy Minister, I made this point before to the Minister, we did have a scheme using Reef Fund to finance a community share and then lever in private capital by way of a loan from Triodos, Co-op and the Close Brothers, and that allowed these ventures to be funded very substantially by the private sector on the security of the future income stream coming from the development. I would like to see the government building on that model in future. But what I want to say in this speech, in my generous time, that yes, of course.
Douglas Lumsden. I thank Fergus Hume for taking an intervention. It's just on that point he was making about funding, and it was a point that Sarah Boyack had made earlier. But does he feel that the Scottish National Investment Bank, that may be a route for some communities to actually get some funding to get their projects off the ground?
Fergus Hume. I do agree with the point Mr Lumsden and Ms Boyack made, and I think that when I'm on this point, Scottish National Investment Bank, GB Energy should work together. The Scottish Government and the UK Government must work together. The wind that we generate in Scotland needs a market. It doesn't stop at the border. In fact, electricity doesn't know where borders are. So, and I know that there is some good work between the Minister and Michael Shanks, but I'm happy to take Dr Allen's intervention.
Minister.
I thank the member for giving way, and he anticipates what I would have to say there, which is that there has indeed been very positive working between the two governments on this issue, and the member raises the prospect of CARES working with the Scottish Government. The Scottish Government, or with the UK Government rather, CARES is doing exactly that, and we hope that will long continue.
Fergus Hume.
I hope that will be added to my already elastic time quota, Presiding Officer. But I entirely agree. What I'm saying is that I think that integration should be a kind of rewiring of British government in relation to this issue. It's just too important for us to be squabbling about it politically, particularly when there is a wider consensus between most of the main parties, I think. So I suggest, again, that there should be a standing committee chaired by the UK Energy Minister, with the Scottish ministers and other devolved administrations, with companies and with the plethora of public bodies that Audrey Nicholl referred to involved, but one leading body to drive the whole thing along. Otherwise, it's going to get stuck in the mew of regulatory bodies not doing their job quickly enough. The barrier, though, as the Grampian Chamber of Commerce survey found this week, is that there has been relatively flat investment in renewables in the supply chain for the last 5 years. There is an astonishing consensus that oil and gas should be supported, both amongst 91% of the business survey recently reported, 70% of the Scottish population, according to True North. And the sooner all governments can recognise that oil and gas and renewables need to work together. The skills of oil and gas will be required for renewables. The Grampian Chamber of Commerce report found that these skills have been lost. They've been lost to Britain. We're seeing, how can we deliver net zero, Russell Borthwick said, when we're seeing the deindustrialisation of Britain? It's not possible. So that, presiding officer, challenge must be met. And the grid development is going to take longer than we wish. And the alarming signs of Ørsted pulling out, SSE cutting planned development by £3 billion, are warning signals that we cannot ignore. We must not be alarmist, but we must all work together across Britain to overcome these barriers. There's a consensus here, I think, amongst the main parties. Wouldn't it be great if we could have a grand coalition on this thing and the parties of the extremes would be marginalised as a result? Maybe that's the only way to deal with the extreme parties, one of which is making grounds without having a single person that's a household name in Scotland. Quite extraordinary. So I don't know, I can speak for another 6 minutes if I've got that, presiding officer, but I suspect
that would be stretching the elasticity. I can give you another minute.
Another minute. That gives me time for, I suppose, what is commonly called a peroration. I do profoundly believe that there is a tremendous opportunity ahead for Scotland and Britain, but only if we cast aside our political differences, only if we recognise we're going to need oil and gas for some time to come, only if we agree with Chris Stark that by developing our own oil and gas as much as we can by 2050 will mean that the reduction in North Sea gas will be 95%, not 97%. The difference is actually negligible. We're arguing about something which actually is of relatively small importance, except the beneficiary is fracking and Donald Trump. So things are going to take longer. We need to proceed with urgency, but we need to recognise that the barriers are very serious and they require grown-up working together. So with two Latin tags to finish off this extended peroration, presiding officer, by all means, carpe diem, but at the same time, follow the mottos of the late Emperors Augustus and Titus, Festina Lenti.
Thank you, Mr Ewing. We now move to closing speeches, and I call Patrick Harvey, again, around 6 minutes. Mr Harvey.
Thank you, presiding officer. What a pleasure to follow that. This has been an interesting balance of constructive debate, consensus, but also some disagreement. Alex Rowley, Michael Matheson and Emma Harper were among the many members who very clearly expressed not just the connection between the infrastructure challenges that we face and the attitudes of the public. In a sense, setting out that the direct energy benefit of that renewable energy infrastructure needs to be connected to an economic and a social public benefit, and that if we do that, we'll earn, retain and lock in public support for the transition. They made that connection, but they also showed up the gulf between where we are now in Scotland and what those countries that have been truly successful on community ownership have managed to achieve. In particular, Denmark and Norway have been mentioned on a number of occasions by different members. And we do need to recognise what those countries have done to achieve the level of success if we're going to learn from those lessons. And so I want to recognise those points of consensus and common ground. There have, of course, been some differences, and no doubt I'm going to disagree with some of what was said by some of the Conservative voices. Mostly but not wholly in the Tory party. Those who've voted for climate targets over many years, and now recognising that we are behind schedule on climate change, suggest that we slow down rather than speed up. I don't agree with those who seek to demonise renewable energy infrastructure when we could be seeing it as an opportunity to transform the ownership of our energy system. And I don't agree with those SNP voices who have expressed some opposition to the windfall tax on fossil fuel profiteers, for example. This is an industry which has done a huge amount to bring about the climate emergency, done a huge amount to promote climate denial conspiracy, and done very little to invest in their own workforce, knowing that the transition has to come along. The windfall tax is one way of ensuring that highly profitable industry actually pays for some of the transition, and it won't happen without tax playing a role. I give way.
Finlay Carson.
Have given way. But would the member recognise the real concerns of local communities that face an endless stream of applications for inappropriate wind farm developments right on their doorsteps? And that's got to be recognised as part of any transition to renewable energy.
Patrick Harvey.
Well, the planning process does need to make the distinction between appropriate and inappropriate developments of any kind, whether that's renewables or any other kind of development. And it's for the planning process to do that. But that is very far from saying that we shouldn't be maximising the opportunity that come from Scotland's renewable potential. I also disagree with the Liberal Democrat support for Rosebank that was expressed, a project which will not improve energy security, not reduce energy costs, and which will merely eke out the old, failed, polluting and profit-driven energy system of the past a little longer, while keeping emissions rising. I was much more enthusiastic about Beatrice Wishett's comments about Shetland Heat, Energy and Power, which I've had the chance to visit. I even got the opportunity to operate the grabber at the energy from waste plant. I'll be even more enthusiastic about that project once they've moved away from energy from waste and onto more sustainable energy sources. But it's the kind of project that we should be seeing a great deal more of around the country. Christine Graham talked about her concern that better off communities may be better placed to get the benefit, may be more likely to benefit from community ownership. And that is a challenge with the current model. But that's a case for moving away from the current model where communities have to negotiate for mere community benefit and instead shift power to community hands, including publicly owned community energy companies, whether in community hands or at local authority level. In closing, Presiding Officer, I'd like us to think about the energy system we're trying to aspire to. What will it look like in the future once we've made the transition to a genuinely sustainable energy system, but also one with a great deal more emphasis on community ownership? Whether that's wind, solar, storage, whether that's rural or urban communities, what will those communities look like? Well, they'll be communities that do have not just power in the sense of energy sources, but political and economic power at their disposal, where far more of the income that's generated from the energy system is invested back into our community, including, for example, in energy efficiency and heat decarbonisation. Why on earth shouldn't we see an energy system that pays for those costs rather than leaving those costs on the public purse while the private sector takes the profit from the energy system? It would be an energy system in which we see much more reliance on local energy companies to lock in that benefit, using publicly owned land, buildings and assets, as well as public borrowing capacity to invest in systems that will generate profit for the future in public hands. And there are many who've made the case that, in particular, rural, remote communities, villages, or indeed islands are natural places where we can see the opportunity to put local resources to good use. And there are many examples where that has been attempted. But I want to make the case that we can see our urban communities in the same sense, whether at a community scale or even down to the level of an individual tenement block, seeing it as a green energy island in its own right, investing collectively in the energy challenges of retrofit, but also the energy opportunities of installing renewables as well as storage in a way that cuts people's bills and creates good local jobs in the community. That's an opportunity that needs to be relevant to every community of every scale in rural, urban and all parts of Scotland. We do have the opportunity to learn from the best of what other European countries have done. And I know that the intention is there, but we're not yet seeing it on the scale that it needs to be. And I look forward to seeing a recognition of that in the closing speeches from the Government.
Thank you. I now call Rhoda Grant up to 7 minutes, please. Ms Grant.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Energy is a key resource, and we have seen that community ownership of energy has empowered community and provides resources for ongoing community well-being and investment. And I welcome the investment announced by GB Energy and the Scottish Government in the Community Energy Generation Growth Fund. I think it's very much appreciated, but we possibly have to go further than that. Alec Rowley talked about fuel poverty, and this is often the crux of the matter, because community-owned energy provides an opportunity to tackle fuel poverty. We see renewables often developed in the areas of highest fuel poverty, but when that is by private investors, local communities are not really seeing the benefit. So therefore, community ownership could be a vehicle to provide this. And there are community owners, Galston Estate, for example, looking at how they retail their community-generated energy at an affordable price to the local people in their community. Many of them are suffering from fuel poverty. Point and Sandwich Trust, which has rightly been mentioned by a number of speakers today, also has led the charge in this regard, helping members of their community become more fuel efficient and therefore cut their fuel bills. And this is something we see community generation doing all the time. Sarah Boyack talked about constraint payments and the amount of money that is paid for constraints, which also means that energy is being wasted at the moment. And she suggested that it should be used for not-for-profit heat networks. And I think that is an excellent idea. And we also need to pursue research and development into storage and alternative methods of transmission to make sure that none of this energy goes to waste and it goes where it is most needed. Sarah Boyack and indeed many other speakers talked about community benefit, and the Aquaterra report for Point and Sandwich Development Trust, which said in cash terms the average payment from community-owned wind farms in our study is £170,000 per installed megawatt per annum, compared to private industry standard of £5,000 per installed megawatt per annum. A huge difference. That's 34 times more benefit between community-owned and privately owned energy generation. And perhaps the Cabinet Secretary would take someone from Forest and Land Scotland aside and point that out, and point out which one provides the best community and community benefit and return. Because in an answer to a question, the Scottish Government have admitted there are no community-owned or run wind farms in our national forest and land. So out of the 25 operational wind farms on Scotland's national forest and land managed by Forestry and Land Scotland, none of them are community-owned in whole or part. And that's 1,300 megawatts of energy being generated through private ownership. And Alec Rowley, Patrick Harvey and I think others actually cited the example of Holyrood wind farm on Forest and Land Scotland in Cowell. In the Cowell Peninsula, where the community were keen to take this on when it was put out to tender again. But their bid was totally rejected by Forest and Land Scotland. And I would ask the Scottish Government to ensure that there is a presumption in favour of community ownership where there is a community organisation willing to take this on. I, like Colin Smith, am a proud member of the Scottish Co-op Party and therefore committed to cooperative ownership. And we have Cooperative Development Scotland, which is a wing of Scottish Enterprise, which is there supposed to support the growth of cooperatives and community-owned businesses. And they could play an important role in assisting the development and scaling up of community energy organisations throughout Scotland. But this is being limited due to inadequate funding and resources. So therefore, the Scottish Government should commit to specifically increasing CDS funding ring-fenced from the Scottish Enterprise budget so that they can do this work. We could also look at having a cooperative retailer for community energy, because this is one of the issues. The retailers are all multinationals. How do community generators actually sell their energy into the grid at an affordable price to challenge fuel poverty? And Community Energy Scotland also tell us that all community-owned wind turbines that are operational will need to be replaced by 2038. And therefore, we need to get alongside communities and make sure that we meet the challenges and help them meet the challenges to do this. So what we need to do is look at how we can secure grid connections for developing community projects. This is a big issue because community projects can't develop a number of projects and then sign up to grid connections. They have to have the grid connection before that. So they're not being counted when it comes to grid infrastructure, and that needs to change. We need to look at funding. Colin Smith talked about the Scottish National Investment Bank as that. Should they have a dedicated fund, again quoting this Co-op Party Scottish Green Energy Future document. We need community investment. Audrey Nicholl talked about what about communities that have money to invest but maybe not the land to develop. Could they invest in other community-owned community-owned wind farms or other renewable generators as well? Douglas Lumsden talked about planning and how the same regulations were in place regardless of the scale or indeed the ownership of the planning application. We need to look at that as well. And CARES, a number of people talked about CARES and about doubling the funding and also making sure that the communities had confidence. I think it was Michael Matheson that made the point that communities needed nurturing and needed to have the confidence and investment, because there are also huge risks involved in that.
If I could encourage you to come to a conclusion. Okay. Ms. Grant.
I will. There are so many other excellent points made in the debate. I could speak for another 7 minutes just highlighting them. But, Presiding Officer, we know that community energy provides 34 times the community benefit compared to privately owned energy, and therefore we need to make sure that benefit is returned to our communities. So therefore I would urge the Scottish Government to ensure that all arms of government have a presumption to contract and support community energy producers.
Thank you, Ms Grant. I now call Maurice Golden up to 8 minutes. Mr Golden.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. Last week, the Committee on Climate Change published its advice on Scotland's carbon budget. They were clear that net zero was achievable by 2045, but only with, and I quote, immediate action at pace and scale, end quote. That action includes electrification, such as heat pumps in our homes and electric vehicles on our roads. In fact, the Climate Change Committee's balanced pathway to net zero, electrification accounts for around half of the reduction in emissions. So, as we near 2045, managing energy demand becomes ever more important. And as part of that just transition we all want, we not only have to increase energy generation, we must also make sure the benefits of new projects and technology are shared widely and fairly. So I welcome today's motion, which is right in saying that the development of renewables at all scales in Scotland should benefit consumers, communities and the economy. The Cabinet Secretary highlighted the Community and Renewable Energy Scheme, CARES, and the local development officers, which will be critical in increasing the amount of community and locally owned renewable energy. That's a goal we can all support, and greater community participation and ownership of energy can help achieve it. With that in mind, I want to highlight a few of the contributions today. I think largely it's been a consensual debate. We've even had a sheep and some goats. Douglas Lumsden also challenged the Scottish Government to ensure that the £8 million allocated from both governments actually delivers. He did suspend his pessimism on delivery, not quite for his entire speech, but at least in part. And he also argued for proportionality in the planning process. Sarah Boyack described community benefits as being critical to meeting our climate and nature emergencies and highlighted the role of local authorities in facilitating this. Patrick Harvey stated that we are in a dangerous point in terms of our energy transition and made the case for a reduction in corporate ownership. Beatrice Wishart spoke about issues with the Viking wind farm and advocated for fair compensation for those that host energy projects, and also stated that fishers should have access to their traditional grounds. Many, including Jamie Halcrow-Johnson, raised the issue of constraint payments, as well as what he described as invasive industrialisation. And Finn Carson continued on that theme by stating that he feels communities he represents have been ignored and the decision-making is ultimately too centralised. So, despite a general degree of consensus, there has been a variety of views expressed. Deputy Presiding Officer, Scotland is blessed with abundant natural energy resources, properly harnessed. They can provide clean power, help us reach net zero and create jobs and wealth in our communities. Before I get to community benefits specifically, I want to look at the high-level picture, because if we are serious about promoting community involvement, we have to recognise that policy has fallen short, such as the missed target to produce 1 gigawatt of energy from community and locally owned energy companies by 2020. And on jobs, we saw Scottish Renewables estimate back in 2010 that offshore wind could create 28,000 direct jobs over the coming decade. But by 2022, the number was less than 4,000. And then, of course, last year we saw Scotland's 2030 net zero target abandoned. These failures matter. They damage the government's credibility and they risk undermining public confidence in climate action. It plays straight into the hands of the populace peddling climate scepticism and easy answers. So if we want more community ownership and participation in energy projects, we need to make a strong case for it. Just look at wind power. In Denmark, community ownership stands at 52%. Versus just 0.2% in Scotland, according to the Green Economy Coalition. There are financial benefits, of course. We've seen that across Scotland, whether they be microhydro or community wind. They generate funds for business support, biodiversity schemes, active travel initiatives, youth and hardship support schemes, all of which have tangible benefits rooted in a place that people can see and feel. but there are other benefits beyond the financial. A recent study in Science Direct looked at wind farms in the Netherlands and found that higher levels of shared ownership saw the project spend less time in planning with fewer appeals. I think that speaks to a simple truth. When people have both a say and a stake in something, they want to see it prosper. Communities shouldn't be left to feel that energy transition is something being done to them. They should be able to embrace it as an opportunity they can shape and share in. Of course, we have to recognise that not every community can host energy projects, especially those in dense urban areas, but that doesn't mean they have to lose out. Happy to.
Sarah Boyack.
Actually, there are opportunities in our urban areas. There are things like the Edinburgh Solar Co-op. We could be having that right across both our urban areas, and then we could have community heat networks in both urban and rural areas. So it's that joined-up approach and seizing the opportunities. It's not just rural areas here. The whole of Scotland needs to benefit.
Maurice Golden.
I recognise there's opportunities, but my point is, if you look at the largest onshore wind in Europe, in Scotland, at Whiteleys, generally the community benefits of that have been around East Renfrewshire, when actually just down the road in Castlemilk is an area that really requires it. But I take the member's general point. I think we've all heard from constituents struggling with their energy bills. Some of the causes, such as global geopolitics and supply chain shocks, are out with our control, although circular economy policies, these can be mitigated somewhat. But concerns that net zero might push bills higher are real, and we need to listen and act on them. We need to be honest that bills will come down with net zero, but only in the long term. If we don't, we allow the climate sceptics to hijack those concerns and turn them into a broader backlash against net zero. No one serious about climate action wants to impoverish people or place unsustainable demands on households. On the contrary, we want climate action to deliver thriving, wealthy and sustainable communities. Community ownership in energy is an opportunity to help deliver that, but only if we move beyond promises and deliver the funding and frameworks to make it happen.
Thank you. I now call on Alistair Allen to wind up. Minister, up to 10 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I'd like to thank members for their contributions today on what has been a vitally important debate, but also, as others have mentioned, a debate on which there is a great deal of common ground across the Chamber, and there was much of that in evidence today in the summing up speeches we've just heard and throughout. As we've heard, communities are crucial in our transition to net zero, and they must receive the benefits of our renewables revolution. So I want to begin by trying to answer a question I think Christine Graham asked me about, and that was to give some picture of how many communities have bought shares in a wind farm. So there were, at December 2024, 140 installations in Scotland where shared ownership is either in place or is under discussion. Now, the Scottish Government is committed to growing these numbers and to growing the community energy sector within Scotland, as the Community Energy Generation Growth Fund demonstrates. There are so many opportunities to be seized and huge potential for communities to be able to own. I will, yes.
Rhoda Grant, briefly.
Would he look at the situation with Forest and Land Scotland, where communities are interested in taking over developments when they come up for retendering, that they should be given a presumption if there is a community interested?
Minister.
The member makes an interesting point. I mean, there was a point that was made earlier on related to it, was about repowering opportunities. And I know that this is an area that Forestry Land Scotland will want to give due consideration to. It should be said, of course, Forestry Land Scotland does contribute through its own activities financially to the public good. But I think particularly around the issue of repowering, there is a discussion for us all to have in future. So the Scottish Government is, as I say, committed to growing community benefits. We've talked throughout this debate about the benefits that community energy provides, including community benefits. And as Colin Smith pointed out, both climate change targets and supply chain benefits are important parts of growing that benefit. Alongside growing community energy, we must also ensure communities are able to access community benefits from commercial renewable energy developments. These are also an important tool to ensure that people and communities benefit from the just energy transition that we all seek to achieve. Emma Harper pointed to successful strategies for communities, and some of those being lessons from other countries, as well as reminding us of the need to get to net zero, and other speakers pointed to this as well, and this is always a factor in what we seek to do here. There are levers in our hands, of course, to achieve this, and some levers are not in our hands. But I listened carefully to Patrick Harvey's comments about local control and culture change. In the last 12 months, more than £30 million worth of benefits have been offered to Scottish communities, supported by our voluntary good practice principles, and we agree as a government we must do more. We recently consulted on our good practice principles for onshore and offshore renewable energy developments, which closed on the 11th of April, to ensure our national guidance is fit for the future. We're currently analysing the responses and information to inform a refresh of our guidance. Yes.
Patrick Harvey, briefly.
I'm grateful to the Minister for giving way. And as the Government analyses the responses to that consultation, can he tell us what his objective is? What is the scale of the Scottish Government's objective? Because he's heard from his own backbenchers support for community ownership on something approaching the scale of what Denmark has achieved. I know that can't be done overnight, but is it the Government's intention to achieve something of the same order over the longer term?
Minister.
Well, the member has acknowledged that that particular target may not be achievable overnight, but the evidence that we gather will, I believe, ensure that our community benefit targets and arrangements are both sustainable, meaningful and ambitious, and will help support our just and fair transition to net zero. To add to that point, and perhaps relevant to the member's question, the First Minister has also asked officials to take forward with stakeholders other opportunities for communities created by repowering, to come back to the point I referred to earlier. The Scottish Government can't do all this work alone. We must work with our stakeholders, developers, communities and, as I mentioned, with the UK Government to make progress. I must make a little progress just now. I may come back to you. I welcome the UK Government's recent working paper, therefore, which seeks views on the introduction of a mandatory community benefit scheme for low-carbon energy infrastructure, a question which is currently reserved to the UK Government. As Fergus Ewing recognised amid the thundering delenda ests of his peroration, there are several areas in which the Scottish and UK governments can cooperate, and although he pointed out in Latin that we must festina lente, that we must hurry slowly, we do need, and the government recognises that we do need to move from a posse ad esse, from potentiality to actuality. The Scottish Government has long called on the UK Government to consult, therefore, on mandating community benefits for onshore renewables, and I welcome this consultation as a step forward. We will continue to engage to ensure that Scotland's interests are fully represented. This represents our long-standing leadership in championing community benefit from renewable energy developments, something that Jackie Dunbar mentioned around the comments she made around the importance of tackling fuel poverty as being at the heart of all of these efforts. And that was an issue referred to too by Alec Rowley. All these speakers recognising in many cases the fact that the areas of fuel poverty are also the areas which host projects. The Scottish Government is, Presiding Officer, committed to growing the community energy sector in Scotland, and the Community Energy Generation Growth Fund represents an exciting step forward. in the development of the community energy pipeline in Scotland that we all wish to see. We've seen through CARES that communities are enthusiastic to do more. I know how important community energy projects are in supporting local economic investment and empowering communities to take ownership of their energy future. I will give way.
Craig Hoy, briefly.
I thank the Minister for taking intervention. Obviously, there is community ownership, but there are also issues which are coming forward now in relation to decommissioning costs of energy, both onshore and offshore. Does the Minister share my concern at the moment that community ownership, unless the pot of money is put in place for decommissioning, could mean that in 20 or 30 years' time, the government ineffectively becomes not the lender of last resort, but the fund of last resort to fund decommissioning of community and other structure-owned renewable energy projects?
Well, the Scottish Government does have, the member for instance refers to offshore projects, the Scottish Government does have very developed procedures in place to ensure that we do not find ourselves as taxpayers in the situation he describes. But he raises important issues that are faced by many communities when it comes to replacing infrastructure in the future. I want to, and this will come as a surprise to Douglas Lumsden, but I wish to agree with the point that he makes about the importance of the efforts that are made by volunteers in communities, and also the fact that that can place a great strain on individuals and communities, although I would wish to recognise the exceptional efforts that have been made by the community in North Yell that Beatrice Wishart refers to. I have visited them and they are a formidable organisation. We continue to advocate and act for Scotland's communities to ensure they receive a just and equitable outcome from our energy transition. And whether that's through community energy, shared ownership or community benefits, it is essential that communities can see a positive and lasting legacy. A number of speakers referred to how smaller local authorities, how they are to cope with large-scale planning issues and the scale of work involved, and certainly the Scottish Government seeks to support local authorities in that position. And indeed, the Scottish Government is seeking to work with the UK Government in reform.
The Minister is just concluding.
Indeed, reform of the planning system for the future, which makes sure that communities are consulted at an earlier stage. Presiding Officer, to conclude, the Scottish Government remains firmly committed to growing community and locally owned energy in Scotland, helping our communities develop energy projects and supporting Scotland's progress towards net zero.
Thank you, Minister. That concludes the debate on growing community-owned energy in Scotland. It's time to move on to the next item of business, and the next item of business is an urgent question. I call Patrick Harvey.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the Scottish Parliament corporate body what its response is to the open letter to the Presiding Officer signed by cross-party MSPs and staff regarding the interim position on the use of facilities in the Parliament building.
Christine Graham.
Thank you very much, Deputy Presiding Officer, and I thank Patrick Harvey for raising this question, because it's important that the SPCB, for whom I speak, has the opportunity to set out the rationale for this collective and cross-party decision and to provide assurance that it's committed to offering an inclusive experience for all of those who work in and visit Holyrood. Whilst we've been made aware of the open letter's existence via media reports, we have in fact only just received it this afternoon, and so the SPCB has not yet had a chance to consider it. We will of course consider the letter and will be happy to provide a response. In the meantime, the SPCB, having considered this sensitive issue, I'd like to make the following general points, if I may, in response to Mr Harvey. Firstly, the SPCB remains deeply committed to providing a welcoming and inclusive environment for all those who work at and visit Holyrood. That includes those in the trans and non-binary community, as well as those with other protected characteristics under the Equality Act. In fulfilling its various roles and responsibilities, the SPCB must balance the needs and requirements of all those with a range of protected characteristics under the Equality Act. It must also take all necessary steps to ensure the Parliament complies with its legal responsibilities in a timely manner. As stated by the EHRC, the law, as set out by the Supreme Court, is effective immediately, and those with duties under the Equality Act 2010 should be following the law and looking at what change, if any, need to be made to their policies and practices. The SPCB has for many years provided a wide range of inclusive facilities at Holyrood, including gender-neutral facilities. In light of the Supreme Court ruling, our advisers have considered an interim stance, and I emphasise interim, which supports the SPCB to continue to meet its legal responsibilities and to do so in a way that provides clarity and is inclusive for all of those using our facilities. A detailed equality impact assessment was undertaken, assessing the impact on each of the protected characteristics, and was published together with the SPC paper as part of the interim stance. This shows how we are balancing requirements across all groups based on the facilities we have available currently at Holyrood, and how we can create the optimal range of facilities for all users, balancing again the different protected characteristics. As members will be aware, the next phase of work to look at changes in the medium to longer term includes a wide consultation with staff, members, member staff and other stakeholders. This will include consultation with external groups and organisations who work regularly and closely with people with all protected equality characteristics as set out in the Equalities Act. This includes stakeholders with insight into and experience of gender assignment and other groups with a protected characteristic, as the SPC is required to balance rights for all those with a protected characteristic. I'm just about to come to the end of that answer. The further phase will also enable us to take account of the new EHRC Code of Practice when published later this year. I hope that's helpful.
Before calling the member, I should have advised the Chamber any members wishing to ask a supplementary question that haven't already pressed their buttons should do so. I would also hope that there will be maybe more brevity in the responses to supplementary questions. But Patrick Harvey.
The cross-party letter, which has been published online, has the support of 17 MSPs from 4 political parties and 31 members of staff, expressing serious concerns about the decision that's been made recently and drawing attention to the comments from Lord Sumption, former Supreme Court judge, who said that the Supreme Court's judgment has been misunderstood. In his words, it's important to note that you are allowed to exclude trans women from these facilities, but you are not obliged to. So in making the decision to take this exclusionary approach, I am concerned that the SPCB is risking taking us back to the breach of human rights which existed prior to the creation of the Gender Recognition Act in 2004, and a position that just as little as 10 years ago was the obsession of the extremist fringe of the US Republican Party. Presiding Officer, it is not enough to use words like inclusive experience and welcoming environment. Does the corporate body recognise the impact that this decision has already had on those who are being told that they are no longer permitted to use basic facilities like toilets on the same basis as everyone else, and who now feel unwelcome and demeaned in their own workplace?
We'll also need more brevity in questions going forward. Christine Graham.
Can I say it's rather unfortunate, some of the language that Mr Harvey has used, because the corporate body, I hope, acted in a tolerant and sensitive manner, in a very delicate and balanced manner. The Scottish Parliament has always sought to reflect the founding principles and to be an open, accessible institution to promote participation and equal opportunities. And we remain deeply committed to these principles and to provide, I know you don't like this word, inclusive environment where all, including those in the trans and non-binary community, feel supported and welcome to work and visit. The Parliament has for many years provided a wide and varied range of facilities across the building, including a number of single occupancy spaces available for and used by everyone.
Patrick Harvey.
If that is the intention of what the corporate body wishes to achieve, and I don't doubt that it may intend to do that, I have to say that the decision made recently fails to do so. The member also mentions the Code of Practice on which the EHRC are currently consulting. That Code of Practice suggests that birth certificates could be required from people merely because they are suspected of being transgender. And I have to say I feel almost nauseous using that language, because I'm old enough to remember how other queer people felt when we had to worry about whether we were suspected of being who we are in our society. Can the corporate body promise us that nobody will be required to provide birth certificates or other paperwork merely because someone intolerant suspects them of being transgender?
Christine Graham.
Can I advise Patrick Harvey, and I'm sorry if that's the issues that are being raised, as a service provider and employer, making facilities available on expectations that people choose a facility respecting what we have done to balance different rights in line with our legal responsibilities. Our staff are always able to provide advice on the facilities available in Holyrood. Like other public sector bodies, and I can assure them this is not going to be policed by the corporate body, but like other sector bodies, if we have a complaints process which staff can advise on, which is also set out on our website for those who wish to complain, and which we will consider. But we are certainly not monitoring the use of public facilities as a corporate body.
We have a number of supplementaries. I hope they will be suitably brief, and the responses likewise. First, Eleanor Whittam.
Deputy Presiding Officer, I know that this guidance would have been drawn together with the desire to comply with the recent Supreme Court ruling and with the best of intentions, but it has created a degree of segregation that we have not experienced under the existing Equalities Act. Can I ask how the Scottish Parliament corporate body intends to resolve a situation where trans and non-binary people are reporting that they feel excluded from their nation's Parliament?
Christine Graham.
When I refer to complaining, that goes for complainers of all characteristics. So there is nothing in here that will take away from the rights of anybody entering this Parliament. We await the full guidance from ECHR into what can and can't be done. This is simply interim. If I could ask those concerned to bear with the corporate body until we are able to do our full consultation. We aim to balance fairly with justice and sensitivity the rights of all users of this Parliament.
Russell Finlay.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The people of Scotland expect politicians to focus on what matters: rising household bills, their children's education, getting a GP appointment, fixing the roads, keeping communities safe. Yet the priority for out-of-touch SNP, Labour, Lib Dem and Green MSPs is an urgent debate about the Holyrood toilets. Does Parliament agree with the Scottish Conservatives that this is a farcical waste of time?
Christine Graham.
That's simply not a question for the corporate body. This was accepted as an urgent question, which I'm obliged to respond to.
Martin Whitfield.
I'm very grateful, Deputy Presiding Officer, to ask what consideration was given between the difference between the facilities that are available to the public and the facilities that are available to members of parliamentary staff, but also staff employed by MSPs.
Christine Graham.
I thank Martin Whitfield for his question. Officials consider the SPCB's various responsibilities as an employer, workplace provider, service provider and a public authority, which adds to the complexity in fulfilling our obligations in ensuring Holyrood is as inclusive as possible for all. Many of our staff use facilities in the public areas of the building, and many members of the public use facilities in the private areas, particularly during events, meetings and evening receptions. The SPC's interim stance, as set out in the EQIA, seeks to balance these different requirements.
Alex Cole-Hamilton.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Christine Graham suggests that this decision has been taken on the need to balance the legal responsibilities of the Parliament as it pertains to the Supreme Court judgment. But as we've heard from Patrick Harvey, former Lord Justice Sumption has made it clear that there are no legal responsibilities for this Parliament. In fact, he said judges did not take a side and not provide an obligation to create single-sex spaces. It is a matter of choice for institutions. The EHRC have been challenged on how they will police this. We've heard about the use of birth certificates. I understand the SPCB don't expect this to be policed, but others may. Can I ask that no parliamentary staff member will be put in the position of having to challenge a toilet user in the future?
Christine Graham.
I expect, as I'm sure all members of the Parliament do, that members and the public treat each other with respect throughout their engagement, casual or formal, within this building, which would include the remarks that the member has just made.
Emma Roddick.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. This decision does seem premature and inconsistent with the Supreme Court ruling. The consultation that Christine Graham mentioned should have happened before any decision was made. And can I ask how the SPCB will ensure the dignity of trans and non-binary staff working in the Parliament? And does it recognise that this unexpected and surprising policy change has put them in an impossible situation and potentially a hostile working environment?
Christine Graham.
Well, I certainly hope and expect that this will not put anyone into this Parliament in a hostile environment. That is not the culture within this building, hasn't been in my 20-odd years here. As I said previously, this is simply an interim decision, an interim practical choice being made to comply with the Supreme Court ruling. Interim. There is now a full consultation going ahead, and I fully expect that at the end of that, members will see that the balance, that important balance between the rights of individuals, whatever their position, is dealt with appropriately and with sensitivity.
Good. We've reached the time set for decision time. I've got 3 members who still wish to ask a question. I will get them in, but the questions will need to be brief. First, Jamie Green.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Contrary to the view that this subject is simply a load of nonsense, many of us in this chamber are far more concerned about the well-being of those who choose to make this Parliament their workplace, and I think we owe them that dignity and respect. Can I simply ask the corporate body, giving the answer to a previous question, that the complaints procedure aforementioned cannot and will not be used as a means to prejudice anyone in this Parliament or to forcibly disclose any means of details of their private life, including their status relative to their gender?
Christine Graham.
Well, I'd have to write about how the complaints process actually works on the face of it. I haven't accessed it myself, but I can certainly tell you it has been used previously by somebody in the public making a complaint about somebody accessing facilities in the public area and was dealt with by the executives, the officials and the corporate body appropriately. So it has been used previously. But certainly if there was any sense of it being used for abuse, the corporate body would be mindful for that.
Thank you. All through the chair. Lorna Slater.
Members in this chamber may be aware of a lively internet conspiracy that I myself am a trans woman. If a complaint is made about me using a women's toilet, how does the SPCB expect me to demonstrate or prove my ability to use this toilet? Should I bring my birth certificate? Should I subject myself to a medical examination? If you could be clear, please.
Always through the chair. Christine Graham.
No one is asking anyone for any proof of anything, and I fully intend to use the gender-neutral toilets myself.
And finally, Craig Hoy.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. Could perhaps the member say whether or not the Scottish Parliament's corporate body's decision was unanimous? And if it was, does that mean that the Green member of that body both supported these measures but also wrote a letter in opposition to them?
Christine Graham.
The letter, which was written, is a private matter. I'm not in a position to disclose it. The recipients may disclose the contents of that letter if they wish. Decisions by the corporate body do not ever go to a vote. They're simply by consent.
Thank you, Ms Graham. That concludes the urgent question. It's time to move on to the next item of business, which is decision time, and there are 4 questions to be put as a result of today's business. First question is that Amendment 17648.3 in the name of Douglas Lumsden, which seeks to amend Motion 17648 in the name of Gillian Martin on growing community-owned energy in Scotland, be agreed. Are we all agreed? No. Parliament is not agreed. Therefore, there will be a division. And be a short suspension to allow members to access the digital voting system. The question is that Amendment 17648.3 in the name of Douglas Lumsden, which seeks to amend Motion 17648 in the name of Gillian Martin on growing community-owned energy in Scotland, be agreed, and members should cast their votes now. And the vote is now closed. Point of order, Ross Greer.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Can I just confirm, I believe that my vote has cast as a no vote, but that it appears my vote on behalf of Gillian Mackay has not. Can I just check if her vote is registered?
Gillian Mackay hasn't registered, but I'll register that as a no. Thank you, Mr Greer. Claire Adamson. Point of order, Claire Adamson. We try again, Ms Adamson. Point of order, Craig Hoy.
Deputy Presiding Officer, my app appeared to freeze and I would have voted yes. I'm not sure if it's been recorded or not.
I'll make sure that's recorded, Mr Hoy. Point of order, Claire Adamson. I'm sorry, Ms Adamson, we're getting no audio or visuals, I'm afraid.
Presiding Officer, can you hear me now?
I can hear you now.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I would have voted no. I wasn't able to cast my vote.
Thank you, Ms Adamson. I'll make sure that's recorded. And the result of the vote on Amendment 17648.3 in the name of Douglas Lumsden is yes 27, no 81. There were 4 abstentions. That is not agreed. Next question is that Amendment 17648.1 in the name of Sarah Boyack, which seeks to amend Motion 17648 in the name of Gillian Martin, be agreed. Are we all agreed? Parliament is not agreed. There will be a division and members should cast their votes now. And the vote is now closed. Point of order, Marie McNair.
Sorry, my app wouldn't connect. I would have voted yes.
Thank you, Ms McNair. I'll make sure that is recorded. The result of the vote on amendment number 17648.1 in the name of Sarah Boyack is yes 84, no 29. There were no abstentions. That amendment is therefore agreed. And the next question is that amendment 17648.2 in the name of Patrick Harvey, which seeks to amend motion 17648 in the name of Gillian Martin, be agreed. Are we all agreed? No. Parliament's not agreed. There will be a division and members should cast their votes now. And the vote is now closed. And the result of the vote on amendment number 17648.2 in the name of Patrick Harvey is yes 29, no 85. There were no abstentions. The amendment is therefore not agreed. And the final question is that motion 17648 in the name of Gillian Martin as amended on growing community-owned energy in Scotland be agreed. Are we all agreed? No. Parliament is not agreed. There will be a division and members should cast their votes now. And the vote is now closed. Point of order, Beatrice Wishart.
Presiding officer, my app wouldn't connect. I would have voted yes.
Thank you, Ms Wishart. I'll make sure that is recorded. And the result of the vote on motion 17648 in the name of Gillian Martin as amended is yes 86, no 28. There were no abstentions. Therefore, the motion as amended is agreed. And that concludes decision time. There will be a brief suspension before we move to members' business.
Hello and welcome to Broadcasting Scotland. My name is Lewis McGlynn.
Hello and welcome to Broadcasting Scotland. My name is Saoirse Healy.
Hello and welcome to Broadcasting Scotland. My name is Donald C. Stewart. Broadcasting Scotland is Scotland's independent broadcaster, providing factual news, reporting on the issues important to the people of Scotland.
We are committed to public service broadcasting, and with your support, we will produce even more programmes.
Provide opportunities for young people interested in media production and broadcasting, and challenge preconceptions of what Scottish media looks like, amplifying Scotland's voice and reflecting its communities.
We can already deliver high-quality live news, and we will create the highest quality programmes for you to enjoy. But we can only do that with your support.
So please subscribe to and share our channel or donate to Broadcasting Scotland via the link in the description. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.